welcome to this morning's meeting of the London Assembly's Transport Committee. First of all, can I take any apologies for absence?
Thank you, Chair. Apologies for absence received from Assembly Member Shah.
Thank you very much, and also apologies that Assembly Member Bailey's got to leave early in the meeting, so thank you for that. Before we get on to our main business, which is looking at Crossrail, everyone is encouraged to take part in our discussions on social media using the hashtag AssemblyTransport. Welcome everyone who's in the public gallery this morning and those watching online. Could everyone please make sure that electronic devices are switched to silent, and that is silent, not vibrate, because the microphones pick that up. Declarations of interest, can we note those in the report? Are there any other declarations members wish to make? Noted, thank you. Minutes, can we please agree the minutes from our meeting on the 5th of February as a correct record? Lovely, thank you very much. And can we note the completed and outstanding actions from our previous meetings? Thank you very much indeed. And action taken under delegated authority. Can we note the recent actions taken by myself as Chair in consultation with party group leads as set out in the report? Agreed. Lovely, thank you very much indeed. Right, let's move on to our main item today, which is the Elizabeth line, as it will be known, Crossrail, as it's still known to many of us. This is our final hearing out of a series we've had looking at what has happened with Crossrail and also looking forward. So I'd like to welcome our guests this morning. Starting off, we've got Andrew Wolstenholme, the former Crossrail Chief Executive Officer who left last March from Crossrail. Simon Wright, who took over and was the Chief Executive of Crossrail last year. Welcome along to the meeting. Howard Smith, Crossrail Operations Director. And then we have from Network Rail, because we've been focusing on the tunnel section, but Crossrail goes out to east and west on Network Rail lines. And we've got Rupert Walker, Network Rail Strategy and Planning Director South, thank you. And Meliha, Duymaz, who is the Network Rail Route Manager for Anglia. So thank you all very much indeed for coming along this morning. We've got a lot to get through, a lot of detail we want to try to clarify. And I realise some sections aren't going to be relevant for Network Rail, so we're not expecting you to answer those, but there's a few areas we might like your comment from your organisation. So if I can start off really and to ask, when did it become apparent to you that the opening date of December 2018 would not be met? Maybe I could start with Andrew.
Caroline, thank you. Can I just say, Chair, thank you for inviting me here today. It's hugely important that we understand the context of these questions and that we take lessons away, so I'm pleased to be here. Of course, I've been in this chamber a number of times because having been Chief Executive from 2011, we came most years to the Scrutiny Committee. So the question about when do we become aware, I left in March 2018, which is a year ago now. The plan that we had in place in March 2018 still identified a route through to a December 18 opening date. But it was quite clear in March 2018, and indeed the first quarter of 2018, that came with risks, and those risks were very well translated, and those risks were very well socialised. And I can go into detail about when some of those risks became apparent. When you manage a programme of this size and complexity, and I suppose in my career over 30 years as an engineer, one has to get used to meeting huge challenges that appear on the way, and one has to be able to deal with those huge challenges. But in answer to your question, in the latter stage of 2017, of course we were dealing with huge complexity and major challenges throughout the programme, but that the programme still identified a route through to December 2018, as I said, with a number of major risks, and those risks were very well socialised within our board, within the sponsor board, and with the stakeholders.
Okay, so really from late 2017 and certainly the first quarter of 2018 before you left, there were clearly some very strong risks. You say they were identified, you thought you could deliver it, but they were big risks.
Yes, I mean, our job as executive is to find ways through the major challenges. And I can take you back into every single year of Crossroad, to deliver 42 kilometres of tunnels and 10 kilometres of sprayed concrete and 10 deep stations. One has to understand the nature of these programs and the sorts of risks that you find. I can take you to any one of those years and to summarise some of the risks that we had to deal with.
Okay, lovely. Thank you. We'll get into some more detail on some of the risks later on. Simon.
Well, as I took this committee through previously, there was a series of events, and I want to sort of move forward. In April of 2018, we set out with sponsors a series of checkpoints, and sponsors had asked us to set out a number of gateways, if you like, checkpoints, and we did that, and we agreed with them in April that there would be these 3 checkpoints, one in June, one in July, and one in October. And that was in order to take a pulse check, if you like, on progress and risks and confidence. And so that was set out, and we were working our way through what was by then the start of dynamic testing. If you remember that the dynamic testing was delayed, and if you remember we had the failure of the voltage transformer at Pudding Mill Lane back in late 17, and so we did not start dynamic testing until February of 2018. And we were working our way through dynamic testing, but that, as I said before, progress was not what it would have been or could have been for various reasons, a variety of reasons. Infrastructure was not as well installed or as mature as we wanted. The train was not as mature as we would have liked, and therefore progress during the spring and early summer of 2018 was less than we would have expected and wanted. However, we remain confident that there was a way through that to the opening in December 18. And as you can imagine, there has always been and remained throughout that period a huge political drive towards meeting that date. Everybody wanted that to happen. We wanted it to happen, the sponsors wanted it to happen. So there was a massive amount of focus on delivering against that date. As we went through into June 18, actually we had a number of conversations with our signalling supplier, Siemens, around that the challenge that was being faced was that there was forecast to be insufficient time to complete all the tests that were needed. There are many, many hundreds of tests that are needed. They all have to pass successfully for you to get your license to operate. Of course, we could never sanction opening unless the railway was safe and reliable. So you have to have those two things. We went to Germany on the 6th of June 2018 to hold discussions with Siemens, and we went to Germany a lot. This was not a sort of one-off occasion. We often went to see Siemens in Germany. But we went on the 6th of June to hold discussions on whether or not there was an alternative route to a successful opening, which was to reduce the functionality of the signalling system where it was possible and safe to do. Of course, you can't take out safety critical elements, but there are some functions on a very, very sophisticated digital signalling system which you could open the railway without them being there. They're there for operational reasons or for efficient maintenance, and Howard could explain a bit more about that later if you wanted. We had that meeting in Germany, and there was a positive atmosphere about there being an opportunity to reduce the functionality, to reduce the amount of testing time, such that we could still open in December 18. And we came away from there with a series of actions for both them and us, and the train operator, and for Bombardier. And there would be a plan drawn up as to how those tests could be reconstrued so that you would then still have time to do the testing and to open the railway on the due date. All this time we were, of course, keeping sponsors well aware of what was going on. When we had concluded that exercise, it became apparent that there was not much signalling functionality that could be omitted safely. And of course, the challenge remained, if you were to go down that route, you would have to introduce that signalling functionality subsequently. And therefore, whilst one might have been able to have done that, you would then have the issue about when and how you introduce that functionality later on. And so there's a balance of opportunity and then future risk. And in a wide discussion within Crossrail, within the sponsors, we decided that that was unlikely to be a value for money, safe, operable and beneficial option to take. We put to Siemens, therefore, that we wanted them to work up two options in detail and produce a schedule, one with full functionality remaining and one with this partial functionality, although we were sceptical as to whether that would be efficient and deliverable or not. And by the time we got to June, it was becoming clear that that was unlikely, the plan B, as it was then called, was unlikely to be as efficient and effective as we would have originally expected or hoped.
So by June, for you, it was apparent that it was unlikely you were going to open
It was
in
becoming
December.
more, the risk was rising to a very significant extent. And we were informing sponsors of that. We were being asked to go away and look at other alternatives, which were partial opening of the railway.
Yeah.
Could we open some of it? Could we open half of it? Could we open a less frequent service and so on? So we were investigating all of these options.
But deep down, June, you were thinking it's unlikely we can
The
open.
risks were certainly rising.
Yeah.
We had our checkpoint agenda to work to, and in July, we got to checkpoint 2, and it became clear to us that the alternatives were not likely to be value for money, safe, operable, efficient, and so on. And in late June, we came to that conclusion that that was not likely to be something we could recommend to the board. And it took us, we then had to go through a series of more internal governance. And at the end of August, we got approval from our board and we issued the notice to the sponsors at the end of August.
Lovely, thank you very much. We're going to explore some of the stuff you were talking about in more detail. Howard, for you, when did it become apparent this was not going to open in December?
I'm not sure I've got a huge amount to add to what Simon's just said. I mean, having been around railway projects for more than 20 years and some quite big ones, I think you're always aware that the risks are rising, and indeed the reports that were coming out in 2017, early 2018, highlighted increasing risks and challenges. Simon's described, I think, very well, some of those. I don't, to cut to the chase, believe there is, a single moment on something as big and as complex as Crossrail when the light bulb comes on across a whole series of people saying this moves from being really, really challenging, but there are these ways round, to, this can't happen. It doesn't work like that. I think the only thing I would add to what Simon said is, absolutely signalling system, trains part of it as well. There were also other aspects of the construction work where similar considerations applied, that again, if you looked at them in isolation, you could say, perhaps there's a way through this, perhaps we could pick this up later, but if you actually look at the totality of what that leaves you with, it's unmanageable, and it's not doable in terms of opening an operable, safe railway, and also it leaves you way too much to do in the future when the railway is opened in terms of bringing it all out together.
But given you were leading on the signalling and the trains, you were... What were you leading on, Howard?
I'm basically timetable, operational readiness, the TfL train contract is managed by a part of my team. I'm not a signalling nor a sort of systems integration specialist.
But given the area you were leading on, and given there were clearly challenges in doing the testing and so on, did you at some point, maybe in June, as Simon was saying, think this is unlikely to open this year?
I can only really repeat what I've said already, that I think the risks were rising. Simon's described very well how you go through a series of reviews to make sure that you're not just drifting on, but I don't think there is a single moment when you realise that they're all, it's all unmanageable. I think there are multiple paths. It is the complexity of Crossrail, both the stations and the routeway and the connections at either end. It's the totality of those features that actually, is the challenge.
Okay. And coming back to you, Andrew, when you left in March 2018, did you honestly believe that the central section would open in December?
Well, I think as I said, Chair, we were very well aware of the complexity of Crossroad. If you go right the way back to the beginning, there are three principal risks. One is to be able to build the infrastructure in the 42 kilometre tunnels, the 10 stations. The other, of course, was Network Rail's £2.4 billion pack of work on what's called the on-surface network works. And the third was to introduce 65 Class 345 trains that could travel across the complex signal interfaces. And throughout this whole time, this is a fantastic program, and as you know, this is going to, when it opens, deliver huge economic value to London. And there are many, many examples of fantastic and great work bringing the whole sector together. So let's not forget about the great work that has been done. But let me take you back to sort of 2015. Moorgate shaft, and typically these stations have two central shafts in them. You have to get the vertical structure down before you put the horizontal tunnels in. There was a year's delay on Moorgate shaft, and I know that Mark Wilde in the recent PAC meeting has sort of said, well, shouldn't actually this team have realised in 2016 that there were delays occurring on this? Well, this was typical of the sort of challenge that we had to deal with. Suddenly faced up with an engineering solution that no one could have predicted. What we found on the ground was completely different to what was there on the survey. So these are the sorts of issues that, as the chief executive, as a world-class engineering team, we had to deal with. No one was expecting us in 2016 to say, look, we've hit a slight problem. Can we open a year later? We had the sort of the culture to find ways through these programs. So, when Mark says, look, there's beginning to be a slip as early as 2016, he was right. We were using up program contingency to deal with major engineering challenges. But these were great successes. We found ways through these things. So if you march towards 2017 and 2018, I remember the sponsor board in January and in February and March being very, very clear about there is still a range of outcomes on Crossrail in that first quarter of 2018. And, whichever camp you sit in, you hope that it's going to be a December opening date. As an engineer and as someone who's dealt with huge complexity, there is always going to be a range of outcomes. And I think having left now for more than a year, looking back, there was always a range of outcomes. The hope was that this was going to open in December 2018. That range of outcomes still had to deal with a huge amount of complexity. Some of that complexity lay clearly in the stations. Some of that complexity lay in finishing off what's called the trace, which is the complex railway systems. And we know a lot of the complexity lay in the rolling stock and the integration between that rolling stock. And we were very clear to sponsors, I believe, in January and February and March, that there needed to be a decision to be made sometime through that year in the middle of summer, where it had to be called as to whether there was enough material on the train, enough material in the stations to be able to confirm the December date. And so whilst I think we were working with a series of risks, I think other people were working with sort of direct dates. There was always going to be a decision to be made sometime in the summer about whether the maturity on the rolling stock and the stations was to support a December opening.
So let me paraphrase you. So when you left in March, with your heart, you were hoping this was going to open because everyone is committed to delivering this, and we've never questioned that. So you were hoping, but with your head, you were thinking there's an awful lot of risks, and this summer we're going to have to decide whether we pull the plug on that opening date or not.
That is the nature of the challenge ahead. One had to be able to deal with a number of risks, and there was no certainty that those risks could all be delivered.
Okay. And then, Andrew, I have to ask you this. Obviously, you said there was no certainty that it could open because of the risks. Now, clearly, you left in March, and it's in the publicly available National Audit Office report, confirms you received a significant payment for compensation for loss of employment. You also had received significant performance-related pay in the previous year. Given where Crossrail is now, do you think it was appropriate that you received those payments?
Well, look, I know this is a sensitive issue, and people would say that any bonus is not appropriate. For a 10-year programme, you have to be able to divide this programme up into sort of chunks that people can recognise. And the system that was put in place is to look at the targets and the key outcomes that needed to happen in each and every year. And the process around my own milestones and outcomes were decided by the board a year in advance, and then when looked at independently by the Crossrail Remuneration Committee the year later. If there was a bonus to be paid, then the outcome of that was a consultation with Transport for London's own REMCO. So that was the process that was put in place. The milestones were set by the board a year in advance, and they were reviewed by the Remuneration Committee of Crossrail.
You felt you had met your milestones before you left?
Excuse me?
You felt you had met all the milestones you'd been set before
These
you
were all
left?
milestones that were retrospectively hit, and these were recommended by the Remuneration Committee of Crossrail.
Okay, okay. And finally, before I bring others in, I just wanted to ask Network Rail, when you knew that the timelines for the opening of Stage 4 in December 2019 were at risk, when did you first know?
Refer to Stage 4, and you mentioned December 19,
yes.
So Stage 4 is joining the Anglia into Central Operating Section, and that was originally scheduled in May 19.
May 19, yes.
And then you have the Stage 5 in December
That's
19.
it. You had
this
the
is
two,
when
Stage
Western
4 and Stage 5. So obviously,
Correct.
delay to Stage 3 has an impact. So when were you first aware that there was going to be a delay to your opening?
So in terms of delivering the on-network works, in Anglia, my focus was on hitting the May 19 date, having my infrastructure ready for May 19. But obviously, Stage 3, December 18, was an important milestone to hit. And as far as in the summer of 2018, June, July, August, we facilitated quite a lot of the interface testing our colleagues at Crossrail had to do, so that they can hit December 18 date. So we were working in the assumption during the summer that actually Stage 3 will still open in December, and we accommodated lots of infrastructure access to interface between my infrastructure and the Central Operating Section.
So when did you first become aware that the Central Section wouldn't open?
That was in August, when the day before the public announcement, we were shared the draft announcement by the colleagues.
Okay, that's lovely, thank you. Right, I've seen Joanne wants to come in and then Sean.
Yeah, just a quick question to Andrew, because I don't know if you remember, but you met a few of us on the 6th of March, so just a matter of days before you left, and you briefed us on Crossrail. And I have to say, from my memory, it was all positive. There was no indication there was any risk or anything that was going to stand in the way of a December opening date. And so I'm just going to really ask, was that actually what you felt at the time? Because I think some of us, looking back, do feel as if we were misled a little bit.
We were always positive. You have to remain positive on a programme of this size and scale. If you wake up in the morning, the sorts of engineering challenges that you're faced, and you become negative, then nothing will get done. So I've got no problem at all about remaining positive and having positive visits, and I know many people were hosted down the tunnels. You all saw the size and the scale, the enormity. We were always very clear, I think, about measuring and balancing the positivity and how we intended to find solutions to these versus what risk that we carried. And I'm quite sure that the message I also gave is that there are assumptions in how you complete these stations. There are assumptions around how you complete the railway integrations, and certainly there are assumptions around how maturity of the train was there. So yes, remain positive, but very realistic about the risks at the same time.
Okay, but given that you were meeting Transport Committee members and that we had been in this forum before and questioning on this, I think just a bit more realism would have been appreciated on our behalf, because we have now come to having to have this investigation in part because we were not told of the risks.
Yes. Forgive me, I don't remember the meeting. Was the meeting in here, or was the meeting a site visit?
No, it was the 6th of March. It was downstairs in one of the committee rooms.
Okay. So, I mean, we always try and give a balanced view as to where we are. And I would think it very unlikely that we didn't give that balanced risk around where the rolling stock was, where the stations were, and where the completion of the systems integration was. And that should have been communicated in March, because certainly when I went into the sponsor boards in January and February, March, we were very clear about the risks that we were holding and the tasks we had in order to disperse those risks.
Yeah, well, thank you, but my memory is certainly different, because if we had been aware of those risks, we would have raised them sooner.
Thank you. Assemblymember Bailey.
You say you were, speaks to Andrew here, you say you were remunerated on pre-arranged targets and all those targets were hit. So are you suggesting all of the slippage is after that point?
Well, I think that if you look at the targets that were set and the outcomes that one was required to hit year by year, then one was only recognised for the targets that one hit. I think that you have to set up a project that understands how the 10-year period can be identified in sort of 1-year divisions, and those 1-year divisions, the whole of Crossrail was set a series of KPIs, a series of targets, and as I said to the chair here, those targets are predetermined for myself by the board, and they are separately reviewed by the REMCO after the event, looking back as to whether those targets have been hit or not.
That's where my confusion lies, because those targets were either unrealistic or everything went completely wrong after that point, because as we all know, we are very far away from the delivery date that was suggested. So were the targets unrealistic, or was the slippage all in that last point, in that last period?
I don't believe the targets were unrealistic. They were difficult, tough targets to hit. You base those targets on the plan that you have at the time, and you base those targets around the framework that that plan defines. If you look back in hindsight, then of course, you may have come up with a different view, but I think the board were very realistic about the programme that lay ahead. They set tough targets for the whole of Crossrail. The board set my own targets, and the remuneration committee the year later looked and analysed and reviewed as to whether those targets had been hit.
Okay, just a quick one to Howard. You talked about the individual sort of work lines and how they were very challenging, and that they already were beginning to present a concern. So where is the mechanism to look at all of the work streams? Because of course, if you have a number of work streams, or one or two are presenting a concern, that makes your whole project much less likely to be successful. Where is that mechanism?
Coming on to that section, that's in another section, Sean, coming up. I think, can we leave that? We've got that coming up in a governance section. Okay. Can I just clarify, Andrew, you mentioned that the Remuneration Committee of Crossrail, they sent their recommendations to TfL's Remuneration Committee. Am I right in thinking TfL's committee said they didn't agree with the level of performance-related pay that was being given?
To chair the process was that the chair of Crossrail had to consult with TfL's own REMCO. That was the process.
But are you aware that I'd heard that TfL's committee did not support, and they wrote back saying they did not support the levels that were being paid out?
I have absolutely no knowledge of that at all.
Okay, thank you. Let's move on to transparency. Assemblymember Shalomi.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. I think one of the issues that's led to us and a number of people looking into this was around concerns around what was happening and who was being told what. The three of you have this morning stated between you collectively over 80 years experience in terms of transport projects and engineering, which is fantastic. If we look at this project, a project that started off as £14.8 billion, which was a funding of a mixture of central government funding, TfL funding, London businesses and residents funding. On the 10th of December 2018, that budget had increased to £17.6 billion. So I think there has to be a level of transparency in terms of how that public money is being spent. In terms of that transparency and the information that you as Crossrail were feeding back to TfL and the Mayor, do you feel that you had sufficient opportunities to communicate a number of the risks to the Mayor and the sponsors?
Is that directed to myself?
Yeah.
Well, thank you for the question. I mean, I think that it's interesting. If you go back to the sponsors' agreement, then actually it was cost and not programme that was the major concern. That has always been the priority on this programme. The programme actually had a £17.5 billion tag on it. A year before I arrived, it was a £15.9 billion programme. When I signed up as Chief Executive, it was a £14.8 billion programme. So if you look through the history, and this is perhaps an observation for sponsors to take note on, how do you find the right envelope and the right framework within which these massive programmes are delivered? And this doesn't just concern Crossrail. Of course, I signed up as Chief Executive in 2011 as a £14.8 billion funding envelope. And within that, there were different intervention points. My observation of those intervention points is they were far too narrow. When you're trying to land a £14.8 billion programme of this complexity on a very, very small postage stamp, I think people just have to sit back and work out, from a sponsorship point of view, is that the right target zone? But as the Chief Executive, I signed up in 2011 to the 14.8. Let me tell you where we were in March 2018, because I'm not aware of the history beyond that. And clearly, towards the back end of 2017, there were cost pressures. We were very open and honest about those cost pressures. They were being reported up to the Crossrail board and to the sponsors. And I made it my business that before I left, we were totally open and totally transparent about where those costs were going. At the time, there was pressure on the Network Rail element to the tune of around £300 million. And there was pressure on the Crossrail programme in order to support the programme to deliver December 2018. And that pressure was, we called it the Bookends. This was a piece of work that was independently assured by the PREP, which is the representative that reports into the sponsors, and they took an independent view from even the PREP. So this was signed up. And those bookends on the Crossroad elements were between, if I remember, 300 and 400 million. So if you add up the 400 million to the 300 million, we were going back to DFT and TfL to request beyond the 14.8 between 600 and 700 million. We were very transparent about that. We were very transparent about how that sat against the risks of the programme. And as I left, the programme that still identified the December 2018 opening date and the extra money that went through it and the transparency we gave that, I believe, was held at a professional level and independently assured.
So just on that transparency, you felt that from the Crossrail end, you were very transparent with your sponsors. And in a sense, would you then say that the sponsors maybe did not appreciate the risks that you were highlighting?
Well, I think this was independently reviewed by the sponsor's own project consultant. That is good practice. And the KPMG report. By having it independently reviewed by the project consultant, it was completely open and completely transparent.
Okay. In terms of the governance arrangements then, would you agree that would you feel that they were open and transparent?
Yes, I would. The Crossrail board served this project extremely well for a very long time. I have to say it was well chaired. It was well supported by the non-exec directors. There were very, very difficult situations that we had to deal with, and by and large, they were dealt with extremely professionally and very well. I also, as a Chief Executive, not only had to report to the Crossrail board, but had to report to the sponsor board. So, this adds a level of complexity for a team. But we always reported on time, submitted our papers on time, supported that to the Crossrail board and to the sponsor board. I have absolutely no concerns at all about the transparency of the information that we were provided.
And do you think, maybe, again, bearing in mind the nature of this project, being a very public project, maybe those board meetings should have been more open in terms of due diligence and scrutiny, as opposed to us as an assembly requesting and essentially summarizing some of the board meetings?
I think, I've got no problem about the openness that we had. All of the documents are discoverable documents, and people requested information. I had no knowledge at all about any information being withheld that should have been put in the public domain.
Is there anything you wanted to add on that, Simon?
I think it's an important question around boards and openness and whether they're public or not. the Crossroad board was not originally set up to have an open and a private session. It was not done in that way. Some boards are and some aren't, and ours was not. So there were not two halves to the meeting. There was just one meeting. I think there are confidential issues that boards discuss, and I think everybody would accept that some matters of commercial confidentiality are in the public interest to be retained as confidential because they are commercially sensitive with the supply chain. So we would not have wanted information in those areas being available in real time to our suppliers, because we're talking about commercially, you know, we're in dispute on some occasions. So I think one has to just take those things in two halves. There are certain things that certainly I would not have any problem with being made public immediately, and there are certain things that I think should remain confidential in the interests of the project and in the interests of the public sector who are funding it. So I think one just has to think about it sensibly in those two ways.
I think that's correct. So, but we had examples where there were communications in private prior to the Crossrail board meetings and following the TfL board meetings. So, for example, there was a meeting in October 2017 after the Pudding and Mill Lane incident, where some of the documents that we summoned show that there were discussions prior and afterwards. And again, just coming back to the nature of this project, I totally agree that there will be confidential issues which cannot be published, or issues which may be redacted. But I think that there's a wider issues around the way this sudden news then broke in August, and going back to some of the comments you've all stated around the issue of hope, the issue of that political will around all of this opening in December. That's fantastic. All of us wanted this to open in December, but as experts in the field who were working day to day on this project, that risk would have been apparent to you all before anyone else, before the sponsors, before the mayor. So in terms of the communication that you were sending, which were going to the mayor via the joint briefings, the weekly briefings to the mayor, TfL board updates, do you feel that there could have been more openness and transparency in that communication?
Well, I think there are two points there, if I may, in reply. One is that we are accountable to brief the sponsors, and we did. And we set out to them through the sponsor board meetings, through the project representative reports, through very regular dialogue, as I said to you, the rising risks through the summer of 2018. We were very clear about that to the sponsors. It is not our role to brief the mayor. The sponsors brief the mayor, not us. So whatever briefings were going further, that was up to the sponsors to organise and to agree. So our job is to brief the sponsors and our board, and that's what we did very thoroughly. We continue to do that regularly through a lot of very carefully orchestrated mechanisms, and I'm very clear on the fact that we were flagging the rising risks. We had the milestone agreed process with the sponsors, as I said to you, in June, July, and then finally October. And in July, when we hit this second milestone, that's when we determined that the risk had exceeded anything we could agree would be deliverable by December, and that's when we called that, and in August we then got the authority to announce it. So we were clear on the rising risks, we were clear on our need and the fact that we did communicate those to the sponsors, and as we got to the point where we were no longer able to recommend that the project was deliverable, despite all the efforts of a huge number of people working 24/7 to achieve the December date, we then called that in July, and finally with authority from our board to make it public and to issue the notice in August.
No, and again, just thank you for that clarification, and just to be clear that we are aware that it is TfL's role to update the mayor, so just to clarify that.
Thanks.
Just to Network Rail, in terms of that chain of communication, again, we've seen that there are various different routes by different sponsor boards, project boards, the readiness boards, joint meetings. In terms of the communication, how were you communicated of the delay from all the different channels?
First of all, thank you very much for the opportunity for us to come and talk with you here today. Network Rail has always been strongly supportive of Crossrail and the benefits that it will bring to Londoners and commuters in the South East. Our role on Crossrail was effectively as a contractor to Crossrail Limited, delivering the changes and improvements to the surface network, so between Paddington and Reading and Liverpool Street and Shenfield and out towards Abbey Wood, the changes to the surface network that are required in order for the new train service to run. And we had an agreement in place that set out how we would do that from very early on. And the agreement also included the processes by which we would report to Crossrail as our client. In terms of the way in which that would happen is each period or each month a report would be prepared identifying the progress that's been achieved with the Network Rail works, known as the on-network works, and any issues that we'd identified, risks, safety, and anything, adherence to budget, anything that you'd expect in a regular report. And those reports were presented to our client, Crossrail Limited, through a monthly meeting, the programme Delivery Board, attended by people from Network Rail, Crossrail Limited and DFT. And so it was through that governance process that progress with our own works was passed up through the organisations. As Meliha has already said, our awareness of the delays in the central section came quite late on in August, when the draft press release was sent to us the day before it was published.
Mm-hmm. So essentially there was a system in place from the Network Rail land which could identify any risk that you held in this form of this. So you had an opportunity to flag any risk straight to Crossrail, and you had a communication channel to feed back to Crossrail.
We had still have a good collaborative working relationship with Crossrail, with the processes that are needed to be able to escalate issues as and when they're identified, and actually agree an approach for resolving the issues that get identified.
So just coming back to August, you mentioned that you were told a day before that issue was shared with you before it then went public. But in terms of the risks that we know that Network Rail were identifying, the different boards, the project boards, the sponsor boards, would you feel that you were involved or updated at any stage on stages 1 to 3, given the knock-on effect it would have had on stages 4 and 5, or again was it just that sudden announcement?
So we were kept informed of the progress at a very, very high level by being a participant in the meeting that the delivery board reported into, and as others on the panel have already said to you, Crossrail is a very, very complex programme with many issues similar to those that we experienced elsewhere, and therefore our teams were regularly working together and discussing the issues that were being faced and the potential impact of delays in either direction and how they could be managed.
Okay.
I think we're just checking whether we've received them. I'm wondering, Rupert, whether we might be able to receive a copy of those monthly reports that you sent to Crossrail, maybe from the start of 2018.
We can certainly get hold of those and let you have them.
Thank you, that would be really helpful. We'll follow that up. Let's now move on to communication of risk and briefings to the Mayor, and Assembly Member Bailey's going to open this one.
I'm just going to, as the Chair says, talk about communication and risk. I'll probably start with Simon. What is your account of the 26th of July meeting and the message that was delivered to the Mayor? How strongly was risk flagged at this meeting?
I think I'm right in saying that the deck of slides that was used is now being made public. I don't recall, but I believe it has. So that deck of slides we took to a briefing with the Mayor at the request of TfL. So TfL came with us, and I think there were about 4 or 5 of us there. And I took the attendees of the meeting through the deck of slides, and in short, what they said were as follows. Stage 3 opening date, and this is July meeting, 26th of July, I think that's what you've said, isn't it?
Yes.
Just to be sure. So what I said was the Stage 3 opening date in December 2018 is at high risk. We were reviewing our delivery plans and the options that were still available. We showed 3 critical path schedules, timelines. One at P10, so this is probability, so a 10% probability of finishing in May 19, a 50% probability of finishing in June 19, and a 85% probability of finishing in August 19. There were the 3 critical path schedules we showed, and therefore all of those 3 were after the end of December 18, so that all 3 forecast predictions were into 2019. We went on to say that there were 2 options for partial opening. You remember I said we've been asked to look at partial opening. So we said that there were 2 options that had been investigated or were under investigation but close to the end of being concluded, but the analysis at that time was that they were judged to be not feasible.
So you're suggesting that 2018 December was completely off the table in that meeting as you presented?
I think the conclusion we had from the 3 options and the opportunity for partial opening was that there was not a solution that could be opened in December 18.
How hard was this pressed? Because we've had different recollections of the meeting. Are you aware of Sir Terry Morgan's answers to this committee?
Some of them. I mean, there's been quite a lot of transcripts. I haven't read every word, I think it's fair to say. Can I just finish my description of that meeting, because there's an important final segment of the slides. So we went through those options and those conclusions. We also were clear on the next steps. So we said, there was a final slide, I remember it very well. There was a decisions and next steps, and it says, we said that we were going to brief the sponsors on that same day, the 26th of April. I think there was a sponsor board on that day, 26th of July, and that we would complete the options analysis for stages 4 and 5, which are equally critical, in early August, and that we would report to our board in August for a formal decision. And that's when we would be making the formal decision. So those were the conclusions to the meeting.
Is it general practice to wait so long for formal conclusion, considering you're quite?
It wasn't particularly long. It was about three and a half weeks. So board meetings take place. We were asked, and that was the timeline that we'd set out. You remember the checkpoints that I mentioned that sponsors had agreed to. So we had a checkpoint 2 in July, which is when this conclusion was reached, and then we had to go through formal governance to get approval from our board before we were able to make a public announcement. And of course, in making a public announcement, it's important, I'm sure you'll agree, that there is not simply that we'd say, well, you know, we're very, very disappointed to have to say that December 18 is no longer going to happen. We also need to be able to say what would happen. So you had to have that conclusion as well. Okay. So it took us to the end of August to be able to make that firm conclusion and to get authority from the board.
So what was the firm conclusion about when it would be delivered?
We said autumn 19.
Okay, thank you, Chair.
That's very clear.
That was the announcement I made at the end of August in the public.
We've had differing opinions from differing people.
Well, that's what I said at the end of August 19. I think that's on record.
I'm happy to hear your very firm opinion, I'm just saying. Thank you.
Specifically on that.
Yeah, on that. I'm just wondering, you say that it was August that you decided that you couldn't meet the date of the thing. Did you not feel the need to share that information with your very close partners, Network Rail? It seems that they, according to all the evidence we've just received, they found out the day before via the draft press release. I bet they were a bit shocked. And of course there must have been financial damage to them as well as a result of that, because obviously they were planning to do stuff. So why would you have not shared that in confidence with your colleagues at Network Rail?
There was always this difficulty about sharing information and formal notice. The formal notice was issued at the end of August, and there is a mechanism for that, and we had to go through the process to be able to have authority to issue this adverse event notice. And that was shared with Network Rail and other stakeholders formally, just before it went out. Informally, and I'm not seeking to contradict Rupert, but informally we had lots of discussions with Network Rail in the team around the risks and the issues and the opportunities and flagging up situations. So of course we had those discussions, but they weren't in a position to act formally until the formal notice is issued. So I think that's where the difference comes. They were aware of the stresses and strains. They were aware of, because as Melly said, we've been asking for possessions to do transition testing across the fringes. And so I think it's fair to say that people were aware, but the formal notice was at the end of August.
Okay. So can I hit you again with that question then, Rupert? When were you really aware that the deadline of December 2018 was not going to be hit? Not when you were formally notified, which you got via a draft press release according to your earlier evidence, but when were you aware that it was really quite unlikely that we were going to hit the December 18 deadline?
So, as Simon has quite correctly said, the teams would have been engaged and were engaged in discussions around the risks and the issues that were faced by the whole programme continually throughout the life of the programme. And certainly, I'm quite sure that in the weeks prior to the formal notification, there would have been lots of discussions about the options that might be available to the programme and the choices that could be made. Also, as Simon quite rightly said, as a contractor to Crossrail Limited, the way in which we could act and do things was limited to receiving a formal notification of a change. So our teams were engaged and working with Crossrail Limited on delivering what we needed to in preparation for the December opening, up until the point at which we received that formal notification. As any good contractor would do, we couldn't change our approach until we'd been formally advised of the changes.
I appreciate that, but clearly you would have had internal discussions, and there must have been a point at which you would have drawn the conclusion that, as we say in Rupert, it ain't going to happen.
I think one might form an opinion based on, just as any Londoner could, based on the visual appearances of the station and based on, as Melly said earlier, the information we had about the testing that was ongoing. But our teams were engaged with the Crossrail teams, working closely together, trying to resolve the issues and still achieve the December opening as hard and fast as we could. I think it's very difficult to make a judgment about what individual people may think, and that's why there is a formal process of notification and management between the organisations so that we know where we are.
Okay, let's ask it another way then. When did you have a pretty good idea that it wasn't going to happen in December?
At the same time as anybody else can draw those opinions, we knew as Simon has said, during July and August that there were issues, and we were in discussion with Crossrail Limited about the options for resolving those issues.
I mean, the point here is that nobody is saying that Network Rail's contribution contributed in any way to the delay. It seems as though what you were doing was pretty much on target, but I'm just find it very difficult to understand why such a key player would be kept in the dark until, like the mayor was allegedly.
Our responsibility and accountability was delivering the changes to the surface network to make the train service run, and we split that into sort of broadly into two parts. The changes to the railway itself, so the trains could actually run, and then the changes to the stations in order to deliver the passenger experience. And indeed, we delivered Abbey Wood Station in 2017. So our locus and sort of understanding of what was happening in the central section was really quite limited. We had the interface points, and clearly we needed to manage across those interface points. But essentially, our focus and our determination was to deliver the works that we'd been contracted to on time.
Okay, so what you're saying is that you really only started to get a sniff of this in July, is that what you're saying?
Correct.
Thank you.
Thank you. Before I bring our next member in, can we welcome pupils from St Helens Catholic Primary School from Newham? Welcome to City Hall. This is the London Assembly's Transport Committee, and we've got guests before us today answering questions on the new Crossrail line, which we call the Elizabeth line, which is the new tube and railway line from east of London across to West London.
Straight
that
through
will
Newham.
open in. Does it go through Newham?
It certainly does.
There we go,
Stratford
through
Newham.
Newham. There you go, testing my borough knowledge. But it will be a fantastic line when it opens, but it was due to open in part last year and it's delayed, and we're trying to find out why it was delayed and when we hope it will open in the future. So you're very welcome. Our next question is from Assembly Member Copley.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I want to move on to the question of these the weekly briefings that were prepared and sent to the Mayor by TfL. So if I could start with you, Andrew, what was your involvement in drafting the weekly reports, and how well did these reports reflect the situation on the ground?
As Simon has previously said, the relationship between Crossrail and the Mayor came through Transport for London, not through Crossrail. Mm-hmm. My tenure on this programme has spanned 2 mayors, and the frequency within which you meet the mayors changed over that time, and that's perfectly understandable. If I recall, when Sadiq Khan came to become mayor, then there was a timetable, I think, set of between those meetings, and I can't remember whether they were quarterly or every 2 months, but that was the sort of timetable, I think, within the 2017 parameter. Towards the end of 2017, 2018, then there were more frequent meetings. Now, in my time up to the end of 2018 quarter 1, these meetings were not at a weekly level. These meetings were at, I think, monthly or 2 monthly levels.
And I'm talking about there were written briefings that were prepared by Crossrail, went to TfL, and then went on to City Hall. That's what I'm talking about. Were you involved in preparing the information that went into these briefings?
We produced a lot of information for a lot of different stakeholders. So, you've got the board, the 2 joint sponsors, and different report lines in different directions. So we were frequently preparing reports based on the information that came in real time, up from our supply chains, up from our delivery groups, through our own programme management office. So perfectly well aware that we were delivering balanced information in real time that was issued to our sponsors, in this case Transport for London, who would then process that and issue it on to the Mayor.
Okay, and Simon, could you talk about your involvement in this? What's your recollection of these written briefings?
Certainly, we were asked to contribute, so we wrote a briefing note, and that note went to TfL, and from that they prepared their own briefing of the Mayor as far as, and thereafter it was their process, not ours. So we provided an initial briefing note, and that was done through our Chief of Staff.
Thank you. And Howard, if I come to you now, because we've got some emails that we've seen from you regarding the content of some of these weekly briefings, which you might be aware of from the summons documents, and because as we learned from Sir Terry, TfL took certain bits out and edited the documents before they were sent on to City Hall, and we in our briefing here there's a particular briefing where there was a section in it related to which said there was insufficient testing time, and that was taken out, I think, by the Commissioner himself, and you were quite adamant in an email on the 19th of July that the June, I'm terribly sorry, get my months mixed up again. You were quite adamant that that this paragraph should be included, and the Mayor should be aware that there was this whole issue about insufficient testing time. Can you remember why you were so adamant that this wasn't taken out of the briefing that went to City Hall?
So almost sort of preface that by saying what was my role in it. I should say, to start with, I'm a TfL employee. I've been working within the Crossrail project since February 13. So my role in these was generally to see the Crossrail part of the report prepared by the Chief of Staff come across, and the particular bit that I added generally was the rolling stock element. I'm aware, that a number of emails have been disclosed. If I'm honest, I can't remember every word of every one of them. What I would say is that, you'll know from the volume of them that there was a huge amount of traffic backwards and forwards, generally, dare I say it, quite late on a Friday. If you time some of those, you'll see that they're, have a good weekend, blimey, we're still all here kind of context. So, yeah, I think one of them says, we ought to be saying there's insufficient time. I think somebody came back and said, no, I don't think we made that clear at a meeting yesterday. I think I said basically fine, and then, as I say, the following week's report, or the week, these were weekly reports, so it wasn't a huge issue. This wasn't polishing something that, as I say, was going to stand for 3 months as a item of record. It was what went in this week's report, next week's report, etc. That's the context, if that helps. You want to point me to what I said?
Yes, sorry, yes. I
thought you might.
We've got an email here. This is the one on the 19th of June. You say, removing the statement, insufficient testing time, is wrong. And then you say, if it's Andy or Steph who've done so, I think you need to explain that we, one, see this as a critical issue that we need to note. I'd remind them that we have been... I remind them we have been taken to task, brackets on stage 2, for not highlighting risks. If it's Mike, I don't think it changes my view, but he is the boss. So you were quite adamant there that it sounds from that you were quite adamant that this needed to be included in that briefing. And I mean, I'm wondering why you think that it was taken out by, as it transpired, Mike Brown.
I think I'm trying to get the words right. It needs to be seen in context. As I say, these were weekly reports trying to... One of the things that, KPMG have picked up, for instance, on Crossrail is you can work all off data, or you could, and that potentially leads you into having so much information you can't draw conclusions, or you can try and, choose simple words, if you like, that sometimes aren't fully reflective of all the data that's around, but try to interpret what's going on. In a weekly report, obviously that week I thought it was important that we flagged in the context of stage 2. I think that's what I remember. Stage 2 was Heathrow, testing for Heathrow, and if somebody had said you didn't flag that, testing on Heathrow wasn't being given sufficient weight, that was in my mind at that point on the Friday night. I was thinking I'm assuming it was a Friday night, at that point I was thinking it should go in. Somebody said no. Of a large number of people who were involved in editing these reports and smoothing them out, it wasn't something I felt, hugely significant. I think that's the response.
The way the email is written, it sounds like it, because what you're basically saying is, from the way the email is written, it sounds like the only reason why you would acquiesce to it not going in is because Mike has said no, and he is the boss, and you can't overrule.
Yeah,
the
could I, perhaps if I was having my time again, I'd have written editor-in-chief. Somebody has to nuance what goes in, somebody has to smooth the thing, nuance what goes in and what doesn't go in. It wasn't being told, no, you absolutely can't say this, but as I say, there were a large number of people involved in putting these reports together. Ultimately, somebody has to say, this sits together as a coherent whole, this fits with last week, this leads on to the future.
So, yes, just coming on to... so we've got another email, this is from Andy Brown, where he talks about Mike Brown not being happy to include the paragraph. Something about, he says... He feels strongly we can't spring things like this on the mayor in a weekly note when there is ample opportunity to trail it in person. Do you know when that would have been trailed with him in person, with the mayor?
No, because, I couldn't, to be honest, I haven't got a chronology of, as you say, there were a number of meetings, weekly TFL meetings, reports on Crossrail, so I couldn't, honestly can't be sure what meeting that would have referred to.
Do you think there was a general sort of culture of with this project of people lower down not wanting to send information further up because of a fear of what the reaction might be? Because it's something that's been talked about in general with the project, you know, stuff coming from lower down, getting up to board level, and then beyond that going up to the commissioner and then to the mayor. Do you think it was a risk that stuff was getting so polished on the way up that people higher up were just simply not being made aware of all of the risks?
I think more widely, probably yes. You know, it's a risk in every complex project, large organisation, that as information filters up, it gets smoothed at every turn. You know, that is a risk, and I think when we go back over Crossrail history, you know, we'll find that there's been occasions of that happening. Do I think that email in itself is a specific example of, you know, suppression of something, direct suppression of something that was vitally important? Not, you know, no.
Yes.
Can I just pick up there? Because I'm sorry, I read this email chain, which clearly shows someone's actually saying Mike does not want us to reference train availability and reliability issues as one of the causes of any problems with the last big testing window. This was also not mentioned at all in the update to the Mayor last week. Well, obviously the trains were the responsibility of TfL. You awarded the contract. It just feels to us, or feels to me, and I hope I probably speak for the committee, given the evidence we had last time from Sir Terry Morgan, where he said information Crossrail had put in had been removed by the time the briefing went to the Mayor, that TfL are trying to water down the risk. Is that not the case?
In general, no, I don't think so. I think what you're trying to do, what was in my mind, certainly when I participated in the weekly reports, was giving a general overall view that, as I say, needs a degree of consistency and flow to it. You know, you can report individual snippets, but KPMG, as we've said, have almost, you know, have made a point of saying that individual data on its own, just taken in isolation, you know, this worked this week, this didn't work next week, doesn't give you any sense of how the project's progressing. So I don't think editing a weekly report in itself, you know, and some of the, as I say, is quite the, you know, is a suppression of something, as you almost seem to be suggesting.
But Howard, you were flagging that there was insufficient testing time. You were in charge of this bit of the project, you were overseeing it, you were feeding back. You felt there was insufficient testing time, and in the end you only drop it, you put, not saying for a minute that Mike's wrong, but my recollection varies a bit. Either way, he's in charge, so I'll drop it. So basically you're saying, I'm flagging these concerns, you're covered, you were doing your job, but Mike has taken the decision to take out these concerns, to flag them to the Mayor of London, the chair of TfL. Isn't that serious?
I think in a weekly report, no. I mean, if I can, you know, and apologies to Simon in advance, you know, Simon and I would have had similar discussions about content of Crossrail board wording, you know, when we were deciding what to put in the Crossrail board. You know, I'd write something, somebody would say, no, that doesn't quite make sense with that. That's not censorship, that's just trying to make the report fit together.
Surely it's also about managing what messages, for example, the Mayor of London receives, and maybe he's not being fully briefed on every risk that there is, which actually, when you put it together, leads to bigger concerns that he may have had about this project.
Yeah, I think to answer that, you know, I think to answer that question, you'd have to look much more widely than, you know, bluntly a couple of emails from me. You know, I genuinely think you'd have to look at the weekly reports, the monthly report, the Crossrail board, the PREP report. Yeah. So what I mean is you have to see the whole story, your whole picture, and say, was this, you know, was the information that was being passed up insufficient or misleading in any way? I don't think a couple of emails relating to editing of a weekly report in themselves lead you to particularly strong conclusions on that.
You're not accepting that the Commissioner of TfL effectively watered down with his comms team the messages you wanted to brief the Mayor on? Not in a meaningful way, no. Not in a meaningful way, but in a way.
If you read that, something was taken out that I put in and I said would prefer to put in, so that's absolutely straightforward. Was that a meaningful change in the context, in the whole context of it. No, I don't believe it was.
Okay, Assembly Member Eshalomi.
Sorry, so just going back to briefings in terms of, again, all your experience on major projects and, your background in engineering, at what stage would it be normal to have weekly briefings on a project if there were no risks? Is it normal practice?
I think typically speaking, we work in periods, four weekly slots, we call them periods. And so typically the reporting mechanisms were every 4 weeks. That was our board cycle, that was the sponsor board cycle, that was, I think most other events happened about that, but then if you go down into the next level of detail, there were weekly meetings. Sometimes there are daily meetings. Mm-hmm. We had a critical issues phone call practically daily, as far as I can remember. So it depends on the strategic level at which you're operating. But most of the more higher level governance did happen every 4 weeks for most of the programme.
Because TfL has stated that, again, the weekly briefings were something over and above what they were doing. And again, just to clarify, that they were not they were not a formal contractual agreement, but obviously somewhere along the line, because of all the risks you have all identified that were being picked up from as early as January 2018, someone felt that there had to be weekly briefings going to the Mayor, who's the Chair of Transport for London, who's the main co-sponsor on this project, but yet we are seeing that some of the information being passed on to the Mayor, not from Crossrail, but from TfL, seems to have been watered down and effectively changed. Would you then say there was an issue around transparency in that discussion and communication, in your view?
Well, I can't add anything, I'm afraid. We made the data available as far as we possibly could, and anything beyond that is not for us to comment on.
Thank you, Chair.
Prince.
Thank you, Chair. Sorry, Howard, can I just pick up the point that the Chair was making, which is around how you feel about this. In the email that was sent on the 20th of June, there's this person called Sylvia. Who is Sylvia?
Sylvia worked in the Managing Director's office at London Underground.
Right, so she was, what would you say that she was Mike Brown's PA or something like that?
Not Mike Brown, no. It was actually at that time she was within Mark Wilde's office in his old job at London Underground.
Okay, that's great. Okay, so you were saying that you weren't, that you didn't agree. You said that, I'm not saying for a minute that Mike's wrong, but my recollection varies a bit. But in this email from Sylvia, she says, in relation to the issues around the train's availability and reliability, this was not mentioned at all in the update to the Mayor last week. Wouldn't that give you concern that the Mayor is being kept in the dark?
Again, I think, forgive me, but I think I see this, you see, in the context of almost constant briefing of one sort or another. So as I've said before, there was there were weekly meetings, there were periodic meetings, there were meetings with sponsors. So what went into any specific weekly paragraph, if you like, wasn't a huge issue. If I felt the story was being, if I felt the story was being completely changed and some part was being completely hidden, my views would be, much stronger. But in terms of what went into one particular report, I saw that as something that, it went in this week, it went in next week, it went in a Crossrail board report.
You see, the issue here is that there's two sections, and I'm afraid I don't think I've got enough information at this moment to work out exactly what they are, but there's something called 2.4 and something called 2.1.
Probably software releases.
Right, software's right. Yep. Okay, so it's clear that the Mayor's not being told about the software. He's not being told about the availability and reliability issues. So there's two aspects. And it is clear that, I don't know, from reading what this says, it strikes me that either Mike is deliberately not telling the mayor this information, or he's too afraid to tell the mayor this information. But either way you read it, clearly you have a professional responsibility to get this information across.
Yes.
And do you not think that by agreeing that Mike, either way, he's in charge, so I'll drop it, do you not think you are actually abdicating your responsibility?
Repeat what I said. 2.1 and 2.4, if that's what we're talking about, are individual they're individual software releases. I think, just to put it in context again, we're up to 3.0.96, so sort of goodness knows how many hundreds of releases onwards.
Well, these are referring to paragraphs.
Okay, right. So in that case,
there's an email you sent that had a 2.1 paragraph that raised some issue, which looks to me like it's around train availability and reliability, and then there's a 2.4, but there's no reference to what paragraph 2.4 referred to. But it's two parts of the note or briefing that have been redacted for the purpose of sending it to the mayor.
Right. Well, in that case, I mean, I can't help you on exactly what the
paragraphs meant,
but the general point stands that this was a process of editing, not for the purpose of hiding bad news.
Well, it was. Let me make this very clear to you, Howard. It says here that if these points, 2.1 and 2.4, are correct, and I don't think you'd have any doubt that they were, and need to be reported to the mayor, we will need to have a conversation with Mike at some stage about how we can best do that. Mm-hmm. Now, that to me suggests very strongly that the mayor is being kept in the dark, and either Mike is purposely keeping the mayor in the dark, or he's too afraid to tell the mayor.
No, again, you've got the benefit of the document in front of you, but again, I put it back again in the context of an overall story. This was about, there were times when from my...
Now, let me help you. Sorry, let me help you. Right? So, what you're saying is, because Mike is the boss, you were prepared to drop the matter. Do you not feel that you should have actually pressed the matter? I don't want to use the obvious example, but there are examples of where people have abdicated their responsibility by saying, well, I was just acting under orders. I don't want to use the obvious example of that, but that looks to me as though you're almost in that position.
Yeah, so can I...
And it's good that you're flagging up the issue, but it's not good that you didn't press home the...
No, so can I just give you my final sort of answer on that, which is, again, if every week or in series of reports I was being told, don't say this, don't mention that, that would be a very, very serious issue for me. I'd understand what you were getting at. It's about if it's about specific paragraphs of particular weekly reports, when reports were going in on a nearly daily, weekly basis at that stage, that to me, I'd bring you back to the idea. That's not suppression.
Let's just put the ball back in. Let's just put the ball back into your, because I'm conscious of time and I want to bring this to an end. Because I could go on for hours, as they know. So what you're saying is that this was probably just a one-off situation. But if this was to happen on every weekly report, you'd be more concerned.
Yes.
So if, when we trail back through these reports, we find a number of examples of this, would you have to change your position then?
If you were finding systemic sort of process of my comments being taken out, yes, absolutely.
Well, we'll have a look.
Yeah. No,
thank you.
Please, happy to.
Thank you. Let's move on to governance. You're going to lead on
thank
that.
You very much.
Thank you. Prince.
Right, so the first question is to start with Andrew, if that's all right. Bye, guys. Right, sorry, Andrew. So do you have concerns with Crossrail's... Did you have concerns with Crossrail's governance during your time as the Chief Executive? None at all. Fine. So I will ask the same question to Simon. Did you have concerns with Crossrail's governance during your time? No, well, during your time.
think it worked well, and indeed a number of audits, external audits, actually did comment on that as well. So I think it was effective, and I've worked on many major programs. I worked on the Olympics, and I worked on the Greenwich Peninsula for English partnerships, and there were similar models there, and we've gradually learnt lessons and built, I think, what was an effective governance program.
So there has been some doubt expressed, and again, if I might as well stay with you, Simon, for the moment, whether you agree that the sponsors felt they had very limited opportunity or power to intervene and influence and question Crossrail.
Is that from the KPMG report? Yeah. I am surprised by that. A, because we met them very regularly. B, because we did put a report to them very regularly. Clearly, they had constant access to me and my teams as and when they required. They had a sponsor. They had a group called the Joint Sponsor Team, the JST. I can't remember how many people that contained, but I think it was about 6 or 8, something like that. So that JST met with my colleagues, my team, on a very regular basis to have much more detailed, granular discussions around what was going on. They had a project representative who we've talked about often and who provided them with completely independent views about what was happening. The P-Rep, if you may remember, sat in our office throughout. They attended almost every meeting we held, including the Programme Delivery Board in detail. And so I would be surprised to hear that that was what they felt, because for me, there was very significant, regular, consistent opportunities for them to question us, quiz us, come and talk to us, look at what we're doing in great detail.
Did you not read the KPMG report then?
I've read most of it. There are many.
You can't be surprised then, can you? Because you know, because it's in their report.
Well, I've read lots of bits of KPMG. I'm afraid.
I'm pulling your leg a bit, actually. Sorry.
Yeah. Well, I'm surprised that that's what they concluded, because I would doubt the sponsors. My view is, I'm surprised the sponsors feel like that. Yeah. Okay. I'm not doubting it was written.
Can I add one more thing?
Can I just make one more point, and then I'd love you to come in, Andrew, actually. Because it's something that Mike Brown, who's been mentioned a few times earlier, said, and it's in his wonderful language. I think this light of touch sponsor role, the explicit exclusion of, as it turns out, the owning entity, TfL, of the subsidiary company, was extraordinarily excluded. I'm not quite sure if you quite
Couldn't
understand
hear the final word.
So he's complaining that TfL were excluded. He's saying, I think this light of touch sponsor role, the explicit exclusion of, as it turns out, as I say, it's in this lovely lyrical language, the owning entity, TfL, of the subsidiary company was extraordinarily excluded.
Again,
and if you can keep that on board,
yeah.
Andrew,
So
when you come back.
again, each sponsor had a non-exec board member throughout, and that was increased more recently to 2. So 2 NEDs sat on our board. Obviously, Howard has already said he works for TfL, so he's in our office 24/7, almost literally. And so we have had an enormous engagement with TfL throughout. So again, I'm puzzled as to why that was felt to be the case. I don't doubt that he sincerely felt it, but I'm puzzled as to what the evidence is that is supported by the facts, because there was an immense amount of discussion.
Yeah. I'm going to come to you in a second, Andrew, but just if you can just keep a note of what I'm saying here. It seemed to be they were upset about their ability, or it says power, actually, to intervene and influence.
Okay. So, well, that comes to the PDA. So the project development agreement was written and signed by both parties way back when. I don't remember the date. And the intervention process, the IP process, was written into that agreement and signed up to by all parties. So everybody willingly entered into it at a point in time at the start of the programme. And the intervention points did give them some leverage, but...
So you're saying it's the fault of the bloke what wrote it then, is it?
Well, I don't think it's a question of fault. I know you're jesting slightly, Keith, but I don't think it's so. It is an agreement. People write agreements with goodwill. I think people base them on experience of other programs. And I think they were done with good intent, and actually it worked extremely well for the project as a whole.
Okay. I should probably come to thank you. I should probably come to you, Andrew, at this point. Now, would you like me to repeat those?
No. I mean, look, I think I was asked to keep my responses brief, but my one-word answer of no was perhaps too brief. I think if you go back to the NAO's report, I think in 2014, which looked at the first half of this programme, or certainly the first few years, and setting this whole programme up, there's a huge debate within public sector bodies and across the industry as to what is the best way to govern programmes that sit outside of the normal portfolio. So when I was at Heathrow Airport Limited, Terminal 5 sat outside of the project capability office, if you liked, in the same way here that Crossrail sat outside TfL's portfolio management of a huge number of complex programmes. And the big question is how should you govern these? Should these be completely independent? Should they be a special purpose vehicle? And if you look at all of the government spending departments, this is being discussed and talked about. I would recommend that you go back to the National Audit Office report of 2014, because it did say that against a broad range of these programmes, it appears that this programme has been well set up. Now, well set up does not mean to say that nothing can go wrong.
That's not with hindsight, though, with due respect, is it? If they made that report in 2014 and they looked at it now, they might make a slightly different
these
report.
Programmes are dynamic, but I think what Simon says is this was it was not an independent report, an independent board, it was a semi-independent board. Transport for London and DfT had a non-exec director sitting on that board since the formation. The joint sponsor team was there specifically so that I reported into the Crossroad board and into the joint sponsor team. And I think that there was plenty of access through all of those meetings. And as Simon says, the P-Rep, who were contracted into the sponsors, were 24/7 in our office. Yeah. I don't recognise the fact that the sponsors didn't have either access or opportunity to influence, to have their say, and to put their mark on Crossrail. It was not designed that way, and I don't recognise that was the outcome.
All right, can I just hit you with one more question then? With the benefit of hindsight, which we all benefit from and don't have the benefit of when we need it before. Is there? Would you put into place any other governance arrangement? How would you, if the government were coming to you today and say, look, we want to set up Crossrail 2 board, is there anything you would change or nuance or any recommendations you would make as to how you could do it better?
I mean, look, what
without being critical of what we've already got.
It is always simpler to have one sponsor and not two. I mean, can I be that bold?
Yeah, you can.
You look at other, Network Rail. We're an industry partner. Network Rail, we did not have a contract with Network Rail. So, how perfect can you make these? The perfect governance is to have one sponsor and one person accountable for the end-to-end process. But there are many different accountabilities, and one just has to find that balance between what is right for that particular programme and what is right for that risk. Of course, there are lessons to be learnt, and there are calibrations to be made, and governance isn't about what is written down in a piece of paper.
Sure.
Governance is actually about the style and the culture. We've talked about openness. We had an adage going around Crossrail, bad news must travel fast.
Except for when it got to TfL.
It didn't, though.
It didn't. It was suppressed.
No, Andrew, sorry. Can we? That's not TfL. That's not Crossrail's fault. So one sponsor is a good point. That's a very good point. Is there anything else you would say then that?
These are very high-level, sort of strategic sort of type discussions, and I think it worked well. I mean, I think actually the tensions at times between DfT and Transport for London were positive, and there were just a few issues for which this positive tension I think was good for the programme. None of these tensions, I have to say, were overtly spilled into the programme, and the whole purpose of having an independent Crossrail board is that they could get on with the business of Crossrail and not to be encumbered by the day-to-day issues that the sponsors have. Now, Was that the perfect balance? I think it worked pretty well. I think that if I were in a position to choose this model again in the future, you would take it on, and of course you'd learn the lessons as to what could have been.
I'm really, not because I'm trying to find any blame or any fault with anybody, I'm really genuinely trying to, there's a possibility, less now than was a few months ago, but there's a possibility we'll have a Crossrail 2, and I assume there'll be a similar form of governance. I'm just literally trying to, for free, get information from you as how we might do it better next time.
I hope very much there is a Crossrail 2. Actually, if it had been times, I would probably be working on Crossroad 2 right now. But, the gaps that these programs appear from a sponsorship point of view are huge issues that sponsors have to deal with. So I would have no doubt in recommending a similar governance model. Other members and stakeholders will have a view as to how that can be recalibrated. I'm not saying that it was perfect, but it served actually for the majority of time the Crossrail program very well.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. Simon, do you want to add anything in relation to governance?
It's more in the detail, I suppose, as I think was said earlier. I think the range between the intervention points and the sponsor's ability to intervene, as the word would imply at those points, is very narrow. So when IP1, the sums of money between IP1 and IP2 are actually very slender. So I think there's a detail there about having a more rational, risk-based sum that is calculated rather than simply assumed, and gives the sponsors opportunities between the intervention points more time in order to take action that they would have chosen to have done. Whereas the IP bands are very narrow in Crossrail.
Right. That's interesting. Howard, do you want to add anything at all?
No, I don't believe so, other than just say as the sort of ops person and the person who's still with Crossrail at the moment and moving forward, I'm sure there'll be more lessons to be learned, if you like, at the end of the project. Yeah. That's my strongest feeling, that when we get to the end, when we actually get it open, there'll be another chapter to be written.
Mm-hmm. Rupert, do you want to say anything?
Yeah, just briefly, first of all, Crossrail 2 is essential to relieve congested stations like Clapham Junction and Waterloo. So we are closely involved in Crossrail 2, applying as many of the learnings, the nuts and bolts learnings as we can, from not just from Crossrail but from Thameslink and other projects onto the development of that programme. I think the three things that I take from Crossrail itself are the benefit of having aligned objectives, the benefit of Network Rail being involved really early in the programme, and the benefit of this collaborative working and having a process by which we can escalate issues. And in fact, back to Crossrail, that's been further strengthened by involving us, Network Rail, and in fact Howard on the joint sponsor board from now on, something that wasn't in place previously. So we now have a sort of zippered approach right the way through the Crossrail organisation. So we really truly are able to escalate issues with the things that we're involved with at the highest level. So those are the points that I would take to Crossrail too.
I think, Meliha, did you want to add anything? I mean, you've not had a chance to say anything yet.
The point Rupert made, myself and Mark Langman on the western side will be the people who will be operating the railway once it's open. And the fact that only last month we were asked to take part in the joint sponsored board going forward is one of the learnings from this program, because as we now start worrying about more operating the railway rather than building it, obviously we need to ensure that we are building a railway that can be delivered day in, day out to millions of passengers. So I think our involvement going forward will be really key.
Okay, that's very helpful, thank you. Okay, let's move on. So, Andrew and Simon, actually, and you can give relatively short, quick answers to these if you choose to do so, though yes or no would be preferred not. You didn't do that. Do you think that the Crossrail board fulfilled their role during your tenure?
Yes, I do. I think you have to get the balance in the board, the participants around the board. How did it feel? I felt that we were pretty heavily scrutinised, month in, month out. I think that Terry did a good job in chairing it. Clearly, the board needs to understand the risk phase that it is in. And I think if I look at my own team, we had 4 different organisational phases of the programme. We may come on to that. And I think that by and large the board was informed, transparent information, gave support where support was required, and gave us pushback where pushback was required. How you get that balance right is always the style of the board, but by and large I think the board was effective.
And on scrutiny, do you think there was sufficient scrutiny? Do you think it was how do you view the importance of independent reviewers and whether there should have been maybe more scrutiny?
Well, I think if you look at some of the subgroups that reported into the board, there was a highly effective and very valued independent group who looked at the engineering and the civil engineering in particular, and that was chaired by Robert Mayer, an eminent civil engineer. Any complexity within the tunnelling, you know, this is potentially a dangerous part of the engineering. One has to be very, very clear that the safety and the application and the methodology was right, and we continually use those independent boards. There was another board for procurement. You know, we had to get procurement right. Being a public sector organisation with the EU procurement rule, we had an independent body that looked at how we were managing that procurement and whether the processes that we were delivering, not the decision about who won, but the process that we followed, was that the right process? And at the same time, we had an independent group around the operations. So I think those were effective pieces of due diligence, of further external assurance. If you combine that with our own internal audit program, with the TfL's audit program, with the National Office audit program, with Tony Meggs's IPA program, and on 2 occasions they came and did an audit. You know, what we needed to do was not to be audited out, but for the right balance. And I think that overall the balance of the governance, of the leadership, of the sponsor board, of the audit, of course one could look back in hindsight and say you could have done something different or something extra, but I think the structure and the mechanism was a good one.
Okay. Do you want to add anything to that, Simon?
Not a great deal. I support what Andrew said. I think one of the tests for me of the effectiveness of a board is how well one prepares for the board meeting, because the scrutiny was intense. So we spent a lot of time making sure we were very well briefed ourselves on all the issues, and we're expecting a very detailed discussion to take place, which then happened. The board was also very supportive. So whilst it was intense in its review of what was going on, it was also supportive and encouraged us to be innovative and creative about resolving issues. So I think they got the balance about right. I think there is this need for appropriate skills at the appropriate time. And so as we moved through from civil engineering to more focus on fit out and railway systems, I think there is the need to bring fresh skills of that type along in the later stages. And I suppose if there was one observation, we probably could have had 1 or 2 people with more railway systems experience earlier in the phase, but that would be my only observation.
Okay, well, that's good. Thank you. All right, I'm going to keep moving on.
We've done them.
So this question is to Rupert and Meliha. Do you agree with KPMG that the governance structure did not sufficiently allow for Network Rail's engagement with Crossrail?
On the Crossrail works, we had a good collaborative level of engagement with transparent working from the start. I was involved in the very beginnings of Crossrail 10 years ago, and since then there was an open and honest engagement on the relationship and on the things that needed to be done. Yes, it had its tensions throughout that period, but there was an open, honest engagement. Our reporting through to the Crossrail team was consistent with reporting that we would do on other projects in explaining where we were at. And the teams worked together closely to try and identify issues early and try to resolve them. So in our opinion, the relationship and the engagement and the openness was appropriate for this massively important programme.
Okay, so there's a recommendation that you should be invited to sit on the board. Are you sitting on the board now?
That's
sponsor board.
Yeah, that's the point I made earlier. Last month, the FT wrote to us and invited us to take part.
Great.
So Mark Langman, going forward, will be contributing to the board from Network Rail.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Okay. Somebody member Copley, you wanted to come in on this?
It was just very quickly, it was sort of sparked really by the sort of exchange Andrew you had with Assemblymember McCartney earlier about what we were being told. And, you know, we would go on these visits. I went on many visits with you and with Sir Terry. And we would always get a very, very positive spin on it, including from Sir Terry saying that they booked the Queen. And I'm just wondering, in a future project like Crossrail 2, because Crossrail 1 is not accountable to us at all. TfL are accountable, but Crossrail are not. They're an independent body. We can only get documents because we have to, if we want to summons them circuitously by TfL. And I'm wondering whether you think that in any future project that we, as a body, there should be some sort of direct line of accountability between the arm's length organisation and us that's set in legislation.
I think, as I said, you've got to get the balance right between allowing a delivery organisation to get on and do it and to report transparently and giving access and giving the correct reporting access to those bodies who are ultimately accountable. As Simon says, you know, the PDA was set up over the course of 2 years. And I think really the point at which you have an opportunity to make sure that that structure is right. And from hearing here, it appears that you felt that there wasn't the information that you needed. I think it would be perfectly right and valid for the Crossrail 2 PDA to make some adjustments for that. But I think, you know, we were always, use the word generous, we were always very willing to show people down into the spaces, and you came down to the spaces, and Tom, you were a great supporter of the programme. And many
we value that.
Yeah. And you know, you could, the best way of understanding where things are is to come and have a look. You know, when the tunnelling was completed, it was completed. When the track was down, it was down. If the track wasn't down, then of course you couldn't get the But you know, I think we valued the interest from this.
But
body.
of course, we do still need to be told, and there are things that we can't see. So we can see the tracks there. We can see it, you know, in a lot of these stations. I remember going to Bond Street once a couple of years ago, and it was looking very advanced. But then we discover actually that Bond Street is the furthest behind, and there's all this stuff that we can't see unless we're told about it.
Well, look, I mean, I think if you felt out of the loop in some of these things, for the PDA, for a Crossroad 2, I think it's important that you get that balance right. My recommendation is that these are sort of calibrations, as opposed to sort of doing it differently. And I think that the balance of the board with two sponsored non-exec directors from DFT and TfL, you know, that was the route through which discussion at board level could be passed back. It always requires another part of the organisation to organise visits, and we were very grateful for those visits. But I think, you know, one just has to get the priority right as to where that information comes from. If the governance works well, then I think there would be less need for people other than interest. It was fantastic to see the school group here. You know, Crossrail was a very difficult site to visit. It was all underground. Actually, the ODA did it very well because they could have bus trips around the park that was on the surface. It was much easier to gain access. So the access to the tunnels for a very large time, there were restricted zones. You had to have half an hour's training before you went down there. You had to have breathing equipment. You know, it was very much more difficult. But I think the balance between people being interested, between getting the formal reports, between getting the informal reports, if there needs to be an adjustment, then that should be through the PDA.
Thank you.
Thank you. Right, let's bring the PACE members. Let's look at leadership now. Assembly Member McCartney.
Yeah, can I start with Andrew? Can I just say that we are really supportive of the Crossrail project and are really looking forward to this opening. And I want to just, I was really struck by what you said very early on about, I've quoted you here, that I wrote what you said, that there's a huge drive to meeting that date in December. And you gave a couple of examples about where you had major challenges, but they had always been solved. And you gave the example in 2015 of the Moorgate shaft. It was on a year's delay, but it was a great success, and you found a way through that. And I asked Mike Brown and actually Simon last time you were in front of us about this mentality about people that are delivering these big projects, that because it is so important that you deliver, particularly in the run-up to that opening date, that optimism that you've actually overcome those challenges before can perhaps make you think that the achievable is achievable, even though all those red flags are actually being raised. Is that a fair assumption for me to make?
Look, in any program that spans 10 years and involves thousands of people, you have to create a culture, and you have to produce an environment within which people can get things done, can think out of the box, can be innovative, and can be rewarded for success. It is right that my own style of leadership is to create that environment and to be able to support people when things go wrong, and to be able to recognise and reward people when things go well. But look, I recognise what you're saying, because I think as the programme gets closer towards the end, there are less opportunities to find routes around this. And I explained that, throughout this whole programme, we had to take on technical challenges for which there was no book on the shelf to tell you what the answer was. So you needed people to come together. I have no problem at all in creating a positive, collaborative work environment. And if you look past over, someone said I've been in this business for 80 years. Well, 80 years with Simon. For 30 years I've tried to create environments within which people can get exceptional results. Yeah. And I think that I hear what you say, that there is always a danger when you come towards the end of the program, and there could well be an element of optimism that obscured some of the, balance between it being an absolute date and it being a range within that comes. We were always asked to manage programs on what was called a P50. We were asked to manage, this is what the PDA says. That means in our world there's a range of opportunity, but you have to keep, the leadership style has to keep people working collaboratively. And when we didn't have a contract with Network Rail. You've quoted the fact that Transport for London had the contract with the rolling stock. You have to create an environment where we can all work these things together.
I mean, when we put this to Mike Wilde, he explained that he thought that optimism and the delays in raising some of the risks with the programme came from a place of the leadership not knowing. And he said that, and I'm going to quote what he said, that the management team did not understand the risk profile they were carrying, and went on to say that they clearly did not understand the massive risk that they had ratcheted up. Is that a fair comment for him to make?
Well, I think this whole question is of understanding the risk. I can point to lots of different parts of this programme. And I think that, I said earlier on that as an engineer, having worked on these big programmes, you have to be prepared to take away lessons. I think one of the lessons towards the back end of the programme is that the station scope was too complicated. Did we fully understand that scope? Could it have been de-risked earlier on? That is one of the lessons we take out. I look at the rolling stock. I think, by and large, Transport for London has done a very good job in managing a very, very complex set of interfaces. I don't think, actually, the complexity of building up the modular software was probably fully understood in the early stages. That has been a huge task. If anyone had managed that task, it wouldn't have been any simpler. So, understanding some of the complexity in some of the detail. So, I recognise, I don't believe that we misled. I don't believe that the optimism was in any way incorrect. I think in benefit of hindsight, I would learn one of those lessons. Keep the scope as simple as you possibly can. And I think the aspiration of the sponsors and that we took on around making this what was known in those days as a digital railway, that it is fully monitored from the Romford control centre. If there's a lesson to take away as Crossrail, it is to make sure that is as simple as possible. Mike would interpret that as misunderstanding. I would agree with him that we could have made it simpler. If we'd made that simpler, then coming into that final phase would have meant that those interfaces were simpler, and the issues that have happened right now would have been simpler too.
I mean, what struck me, and you did mention the station fit-outs and whatever, was that when Mike Wilde came and just told us about what was still unfinished, it wasn't those big issues about Pudding Mill Lane or the testing phase. It was also about the station fit-out. So, you know, they wouldn't even be ready to open safely in December, even if the other major issues had been sorted. Did that come as a surprise to you, that knowledge that those issues were so far behind?
Well, you know, having spent 7 years on this programme and dealt with many of these programmes, of course it was personally disappointing to learn that the plan that we developed hadn't been fully thought through. But you know, when I left, there was a known risk around 3 stations.
Was that no risk that had been raised with you? Known. Oh, known risk.
Known risk. And of course, there's pressure on Bond Street that I think comes out.
Yeah.
There was pressure on Liverpool Street, and there's pressure on Whitechapel. So those were known risks. And I think, you know, would I have been surprised if actually the tension on this programme had centred around the rolling stock and the complexity of winning maturity on it? No. Was I surprised about actually some of the complexity that emerged late in the day around the stations? I was, and I think that I've been honest about, you know, some of the lesson there is to make sure that the technology in those stations is much simpler on day one. And if that had been the case, then of course this would have been a much easier programme to finish on.
You said earlier, and I thought it was a very good phrase, you said that your ethos was that bad news was travelling fast. So looking back, what perhaps processes would you put in that would have been different to allow that news to travel up to where it needed to get to?
I think, I'm not sure that we would have changed anything. As Simon says, you know, the heartbeat of this programme was periodic on 4 weeks. As you get into the granularity and you get into different layers of the supply chain, there were weekly reports, and where necessary there were daily reports and daily KPIs. And I think, you know, what we were always working on was the latest real-time information to be able to look at all the dashboards. You know, on a programme of this size and scale, you have many different dials, whether it's the earned value or the programme or the cost side, huge numbers of, as Howard said, huge numbers of data sets, and all these data sets have to come together in providing the information. So I think, look, it is easy to look back in retrospect and to say that maybe those dials weren't calibrated the right way. Of course, we can take lessons away from that, and there will be lessons here. But we were flying on a number of instruments. We were getting a very comprehensive dashboard. The same consultants that have made observations in retrospect were looking at this as best practice for many years with this programme. So, you know, it's easy to look back into the rearview mirror. I think a lot of what we did is best practice. You know, the innovation programme that came out of Crossrail has now been landed and launched as an industry sector deal. That is unbelievable for this sector to pick up all the good practice of what we've used. And the many occasions, I don't want to go through a list of all the things that happened, you know, the sustainability areas, the apprenticeship areas, the programme management areas, some of the project control areas, they've all been lifted as best practice. Could they have been improved and better? Yes, there are lessons to take away, I'm sure.
Thank you. Can I ask Howard, given that you're at Crossrail Chief Operations Officer, is there any new systems in place to allow any concerns to be flagged earlier than perhaps there had been previously? Or is the programme of stopping the clock and rebasing everything sorting that out?
I mean, there are a number of changes to the way that the company's working, but I think the bigger thing I'd point out is there's a reinvigoration in terms of particularly focus on systems integration. So specialists coming in to manage some of those really complex stages of the latter part of bringing a railway together. So it's about identifying the risks as much as, you know, passing them up, so you can manage them, look ahead at where the next problem will come up and be ready for it. So that's probably the biggest change that's happened in recent months.
Okay, thank you.
Lovely. Let's move on to looking at assessment of risk. Assembly Member O'Connell.
Thank you very much. Good morning still, just. Moving on, a bit more detail about risks. There's some later questions about particular topics, but I'd like to talk about something that's been referred to quite often, the PREP, the Project Representative team of engineers and project management specialists that are appointed and contracted by the sponsors to report to the sponsorship board. My first question really, this is for Andrew, Simon and Howard Crossrail, is did you all have access to these progress project reports? Andrew?
Yes, we did, yeah.
Oh, jolly good. So you had access to them because Jacobs were the firm involved, experts at great cost, no doubt, the taxpayer. They reported to the sponsor board, which was populated by Crossrail board members. We've heard all this earlier. And their reports were quite critical. We have some examples here. January, there remains a significant risk to formal handover.
So January which year?
January 18. Okay. Formal risk to formal handover. March 18. I paraphrase slightly. There is therefore high risk that the start dates for trial running, trial ops will not be achieved. That's March report from the PREPs. May, again paraphrase conclusion, there remains a high risk that stage 3 opening will not be achieved. These people are hired, Jacobs were hired particularly by the sponsor board, experts to report to that board populated by yourselves. So when you said, Andrew, that you're cited on these reports, what were your reactions to those reports? How did you feel about those expert reports?
So my responsibility in the Crossrail board meeting was to report on what the PREP were reporting. And the aim of that, the purpose of that, was to see where our own reports and the PREP reports were diverging. So remember the PREPs are reporting directly into the sponsors. So this is a report that is written for the sponsors, and it is also issued to Crossrail. We got the report a month after, so these all came 4 weeks after we'd issued our own report. So I was reporting observations at the board 1 month after they had reported their own thing. And where there was a big deviation of a view, of opinion, so these papers went to the Crossrail board too. Where there was a big deviation, then we would talk about that at a Crossrail board. So there was access, and Simon's mentioned this before. The PREP had 24/7 access to every meeting to pick up the same data sets, the same information, and they would put their own interpretation on it.
Oh, right. Simon, I'll come back to you on that, Andrew, because Simon and Howard, do you concur with Andrew's analysis of this?
Just a clarification. So we don't sit on the sponsor board. We attend and report to the sponsor board. So I think that's just one clarification. So the sponsors had 2 meetings, a Part A and a Part B. And in Part A, the PREP would attend and give their report without us. And in Part B, we would attend and give our report with the PREP present. And so they were held in that way. We, as Andrew said, received the PREP report. Don't forget that their information came from us because they sat in all our meetings, getting all our data, getting all our analysis. So there was generally nothing of any surprise in their report.
So you knew about all these problems that early on?
Yeah.
Okay. Very good.
We had reported them similarly to the sponsors. Okay. They put their own interpretation, it's their words, but the facts and the risks and the issues were very similar to those that we were reporting ourselves to sponsors.
So How did you want to add to that? Or
No, I don't think there's
you're
anything
content with that response? So So Jacobs are hired by the sponsor board. You sit on. Some of you don't sit. You attend.
We don't sit on the sponsor
Right, okay,
board.
you're pedantic to Londoners, but you're there for part of the meeting.
We attend to report as Crossrail to the sponsors.
It would just seem rather odd, again, to Londoners and to non-engineers like myself, is that a firm are hired by the sponsor board, we're not here to comment on that, at great cost, and are flagging up problems, and we have only got 3 examples. There may well be more predating these, indeed. Indeed, Andrew, you get them a month behind, but I don't really buy that particularly. So there's flagged up examples of problems, and you're saying it's not us, Gov, it's the other board who got it, we don't sit on it. So,
No, of course not. We're not saying that at all.
Oh,
quite to the contrary. What I'm saying is that the information upon which they were reporting to sponsors independently had come from sitting in our meetings, in our offices, gathering data independently and putting their interpretation on it. So we were aware of the issues and we were addressing these ourselves with risk mitigation, dealing with this continuing tsunami of issues that occur on major programs. And this is, as you said yourself, this is 2 or 3. Every day there's a tsunami of issues that occurs on these major programs, all of which come to the senior leadership to deal with, to delegate, to take action against. We were actioning these in real time as they occurred, probably before the PREP themselves had even heard about them. So this reporting was going on. Sponsors were taking note of it, as they were taking note of our own reports to them, which was separate from, and in addition to those they got from the PREP.
So, I mean, just lastly, Chair, I mean, clearly the conclusion is that there was expert recommendations early in the year, in fact possibly predating, shared by yourselves, because you say you were almost not the authors of, but were privy to that information at an early stage of quite considerable, significant risks, high risk and another high risk, and they were flagged at that very early stage.
That's what we were saying.
Through both boards. So the Crossrail board itself were cited, and the sponsor board also was cited on these at that early stage.
Correct.
Okay, I think probably yes.
I think I've just flagged from that though, that basically the January report said there's a significant risk to stage 3 opening in December. That was January. So a year before, they were flagging there was a significant risk you wouldn't open in December, and you saying you absolutely agreed with this, which would suggest you knew even earlier that it was unlikely to open in December.
There were rising risks. It's not a question of knowing. You don't know that they can't be overcome. That was the PREP's opinion about the risks. We had a plan, despite there being rising risks, which we were reporting, we had a plan to deliver the opening in December. In January of 18, we had a firm plan to deliver the opening in December, despite there being rising risks. There are always risks on big programs. Sometimes they go up, sometimes they go down. And of course, we're concerned about all of them, and we're taking action to mitigate them. The PREP is in the position of simply reporting against risks. We were taking the action to mitigate them and to develop a plan to deal with them and still to open the railway in December. So yes, we acknowledge there were rising risks and we've reported on those, but we also had a plan to deal with them to open on time in December.
Okay. Assemblyman Bailey indicated, is it?
I go back to the question I asked Howard earlier on. Where was the mechanism to understand these risks? We've seen a number of examples that risks were flagged as early as January, but nobody responded to them very late. And it's confusing as a Londoner because we're not close to having this delivered. We're miles away. So why was there no mechanism to pick that up?
There was a mechanism to pick them up. We had a very thorough, comprehensive risk management system. We had risk review meetings on a very regular basis. They were mentioned, flagged up and discussed and plans put in place to mitigate them at Programme Delivery Board, and at almost every board and meeting we attended, we're dealing with risk. That's what projects are all about. So in every meeting, every day, every hour, we are dealing with managing those risks. So there were plans, very thorough plans put in place, discussed extensively, very, very late into every evening to address these issues and to come up with ways of mitigating and dealing with them.
So why did none of those plans work, and why did it take so long to pick them up?
Many of them did work.
Well, they didn't. Clearly they didn't, because we don't have Crossrail.
Many of Crossrail. Yeah, but but there are thousands of risks. we've mitigated many, many such risks in the past. You don't hear about those because they were dealt with.
And I congratulate you for mitigating those risks, but
But
it's still,
some-
the point is we don't have Crossrail, so you didn't mitigate enough of those risks. And the question I'm asking, and I'm going to add to it, where is that mechanism, and is that a failure of the culture? Because we heard of a culture of positivity. Andrew was very proud of that culture. I am stunned by that because it seems like it's delivered us a disaster. And you're telling me that you answered these problems, but clearly you didn't because we don't have Crossrail.
Yeah.
And how do we know this won't happen again if you can't identify for us where there was a lack of a mechanism to pick up what were huge risks? Huge. We're not even close to Crossrail. They were miles away. And if you can't identify those gaping holes, how do we know it won't happen again?
The risk mitigation plans were thorough and in place. Yes, of course, ultimately in some areas they have not been as successful as they needed to be to deliver Crossrail. I fully accept that. But the processes and the methodologies and the people to unearth, to deal with and to put in place the mitigation measures were there. I think where things have not worked as well as we would all have liked is in the system integration world, which Howard has mentioned, that steps have been put in place to adjust, and in the understanding of the time it will take to integrate the SCADA and the radio testing systems within the stations. So there are very specific systems integration challenges which are going to take longer than we had all understood early last year. So I completely accept that. That was an issue of technical comprehension of the time needed and the advice we were getting from the specialists as to how long it would take to deliver those testing and systems integration.
So you're suggesting
activities.
that the executive team didn't understand the level of risk or the type of risk or the nature of the risk, however you want to frame it, that they were managing?
I think
Mark Wilde, when he sat before us, made their suggestion.
I think we understood the risk. I think where we did not have sufficient forecast was in the time it would need to deal with the mitigation.
So that would still suggest you didn't quite understand what you were dealing with.
Well, if there's a failure, clearly I have to accept as the person who was in the chair at the time that we didn't get it right. So I completely accept that it wasn't successfully delivered. That is clear. We did understand the risk, but all the advice from the specialists, all the analysis that was carried out at that time forecast a period of time that was going to be required to carry out that integration. That has taken, in practice, longer than those forecasts were given.
Significantly longer.
Let's get into the specifics of the risks.
Can I
So
just
we've now got
one to Andrew? Andrew, you talked about this culture of positivity and how great that was, but do you think that culture needs adjusting? Because is that part of how we skated by these problems because people were afraid to go against that culture?
No, there's no fear in the culture. You have to have a positive culture in all organisations that are good organisations and deliver. I think what Simon has said, and I think this is one of the big lessons, is that this sector has huge strengths and it has areas of potential weakness. It doesn't come up against the complexity of these sorts of programmes at this scale so often. I think Mark mentions that, in a calendar year, Transport for London may open 1 or 2 new stations. I mean, they don't build many new stations. This needed to build 10 in 1 year. That means the supply chains needed to provide the right resources, competing against all the other great things that happen in London right now. And I think one of the lessons is, and Simon's absolutely right, we were supported by the expertise of the supply chain in these areas. We were responding to the information, the data that came from them. And we weren't making up the fact that we thought we could do these in a certain program, but there are clearly lessons here. And I think you're inferring what should we do differently for the Crossrail 2s. This is an area where I think the whole sector needs to be understood much more caution about. As I said to the chair here, minimise the scope to the absolute minimum. If you look at the capacity of the supply chain to deliver this sort of scope in this volume, was there a further perhaps stage opening that minimised the extent to which one relies on a very small part of our supply chain? So there are lessons here, and I think that we should recognise that. And this is one of the areas where those lessons should be focused on.
Okay, we're going to get into some just specific areas of risk here, and some of it you may have already answered, so members should be aware of that. Let's move on to looking at the Pudding Mill Lane incident and dynamic testing.
Actually, the first part of that A is we sort of covered,
yeah.
I think.
Yeah.
But can I just ask earlier? Sorry, Andrew. You said what you were doing when you've got the PREP risk assessments. You would compare those with your own risk assessments. Is that right? Was there often then a divergence between what was in the PREP risk assessment for a particular risk and what was in the Crossrail risk register or risk assessment?
No, there were few divergences. I mean, the PREP job is to put their own interpretation on it. You know, if you have two sets of eyes looking at these things, then you're going to get a different interpretation. That's absolutely right. You know, that is good practice. If you look at the other big major programs around UK right now, then they all have PREP. It's not a particularly easy role to perform. But my job is that where there were divergences, and you know, yes, the PREP report took a month to produce, so it was 4 weeks out of date from our own real-time information. And if there was a major divergence, then we should bring it up in the board. And so that was the point that I made.
Because I mean, it says, you know, in the 1st of March PREP assessment, there is therefore a high risk that the start dates for trial running, trial operations of stage 3 opening will not be achieved. Do you recall, did that chime exactly with what your internal risk assessment was saying?
Well, I think I go back to, you know, so this was my last board. I think I go back to the point that I made to the chair, is that there was a plan, there was a route through in March to December opening, but it carried a lot of risk, and the PREP was agreeing that it carried a lot of risk.
But of course, it could be a plan with a 5% chance of success or a plan with a 95%
no,
chance.
that was something submitted in July.
Sorry?
That was the plan that was then submitted in July.
But I guess my point is, just because you've got a plan and you hope it works, of course, doesn't mean that there's a high likelihood that it will succeed.
No, I've explained that on a number of occasions. You know, in these sorts of programs, the nature of the risk, and you know, as you get closer to the opening day, one needs to manage people's sort of aspirations around this. There was always, as far as we were concerned, a range.
But I think that's particularly one thing that was not managed quite clearly, particularly in the last, you know, particularly during the last sort of year and a half. We've talked a lot about hope, and I think it seems quite clear that it looks like people were getting carried away with hope and aspiration rather than the reality of what was happening.
I think Tony Megg, the new chair, with whom I have great respect, and so too do I, incidentally, of Mark Wilde and all of the team. So, you know, the effort and the energy now should go into supporting them, but the lessons that are learned are very important. You know, when you sign up to be chief executive of a program of this size and scale, you know, we talked about these cost intervention points, where you have a 2% range on a £14.8 billion programme, 10 years before you actually do it. Actually, as a set of sponsors, the advice I'd give you is that range is too narrow. Equally, when you are given an end date 10 years before, I would suggest that that is not the right approach in future. And that's the point that Tony Meggs was making. In the same way right now that do not force Mark Wilde or Howard or others to give that precise
end date.
These systems do not mature on a single day. These systems mature over a period of time. And if you even look at the Class 345 train, which is a very, very good train, it will still be ironing out issues as we speak. Not safety-related issues, but issues around the reliability. So I just think there needs to be a greater awareness. And, you know, I talk to different government spending departments about the risks on taking on these major programs. You know, a greater awareness around the sort of band of possible outcomes and how these risks mature and the absolute result versus the ability and the opportunity to manage these in the ranges. I think these are some big lessons, Tom.
Okay, I want to come on specifically now to the Pudding Mill Lane incident. So, and I'll continue with you Andrew. How significant was that in terms of the delay to the central section opening? Because we've heard it was pretty critical.
Now look, I've left this programme a year, so I'm going to have to very quickly get my, you know...
Yes, of course.
Back. I mean, as far as I can remember, we were aiming to get power on, and you know, look at systems integration. Actually, a huge amount of thought went into the systems integration. And the opportunities we had. When I arrived on this program, there was a 3-month window to do what was called dynamic testing. That's when you get a mature train inside a mature tunnel and you work out whether or not the dynamics of that train in single mode operation and multi-mode operation does what it says on the can. In order to start that process, there's a stage 1 train that actually started in May 2017. There was a stage 2 train that started in May 2018, and of course we've heard that that was delayed. The complexity of the stage 2 train, which is very similar to the stage 3 train, means that it has to operate 3 different signalling systems, not just one. And in order to manage the system integration, we had a number of different steps to put in place. And those steps were very well recognized, they were very well defined. We were due to get the first train into the tunnels in November 2017, and one of those events went from a product that was bespoke, so not bespoke, but off the shelf. It happened to put in the lane. It was potentially a very dangerous event, and this was an uncontrolled explosion of a transformer. That delayed, if I'm right in saying, Simon can step in here, power on in the eastern section of the tunnels from November 17 to, I think, middle of February 2018. Significant because that was the start date of dynamic testing. I'm sure one will say if one peels the onions back, yes, but the train wasn't quite mature enough to give a length of time for testing, and that the infrastructure still wasn't signed off and tested. So it was significant. It was a huge setback. It was something that was not planned, it was unexpected, and the sort of incident that one then had to deal with, and the huge amount of energy that went into the suppliers who were responsible for that. That component was made in south of France. The huge number of trips we made down to try and find out why it happened. We could not put on another transformer until we absolutely proved and were certain that that transformer wouldn't do the same and put the public at risk. It was significant.
Simon, can I ask you to comment?
Andrew has outlined the issue. It was very significant. We were very angry about it because these things clearly you don't expect from a major international supplier who've given you lots of guarantees and warranties about all their equipment. So when it goes pop like that, it's very, very serious because no one could understand why it had happened. It turned out to be a design fault, a contractor design fault. So it took a long time to understand what had gone wrong. And then these very complicated cabinets, I'm not an electrical engineer, but I'm a civil engineer, but the very complicated electrical cabinets needed to be very radically redesigned and rewired, and that did take a long time. But the most important factor was understanding the cause. So whenever you get a failure like that, the job is quite sort of significantly constrained because we didn't want to proceed with any other element of a similar nature. And there's another big transformer in the West. Because unless we understood the cause, we were very worried that there would be repetition elsewhere, and we couldn't allow that because of the risk. So we had to stop work in various areas, so it did hold us up. At the end of the day, clearly in terms of dynamic testing, there were other factors that were in parallel going to be on the critical path, so it wasn't the only factor that was going to determine the success of dynamic testing, but it was a very serious event that took a long time to understand. And to many, many thousands of hours of engineering time by the suppliers, not at our expense, to sort it out.
And presumably it hit morale as well, quite.
Yeah, because, it's a big moment. You can imagine, people have been working 9.5 or whatever years to build up to this moment where you put the power on and you can start testing. Then it was a very serious issue. And yes, you had to sort of pick people up again. Can I just touch on this issue of positivity? Because it is a dilemma. You can imagine I've spent many thousands of hours since I left pondering around all of these issues and sort of wondering around what we should do differently, what I could have done differently. And this issue about sort of undue optimism and having end dates and having positive intent. When you've got sort of 10,000 people all working together, you need a very well-flagged common ambition in order to drive people towards delivering. On the Millennium exhibition site in Greenwich, we had an opening date that was set many, many years ahead, and it was obvious. On the Olympics, we had an opening date that was set many years ahead, and it was obvious. And these are positive factors in many ways, because everybody in Britain, everybody on the project on London 2012 knew that we were going to open on the 27th of July 2012, not a minute later. And that had a very positive impact on suppliers, contractors, engineers, deliverers, everybody. I entirely understand your point about undue optimism, but you need an element of it. If a program is sort of, oh, well, it'll happen when it happens, and I know it's not like that, but if it were to be, you can imagine that the motivation and the people issues, the human motivation is completely gone. I turn up, I'll do a few things, and I'll go home. Whereas if you're driving towards success and that flag is firmly planted, it does really improve performance and productivity. But I agree with you that there has to be a limitation on that. But I wouldn't just chuck that out entirely, and I know you're not suggesting that. But no, you need to have a good proportion of that sort of attitude to succeed. And we would have been much less well forward than we are today if we hadn't have had that drive to the finish line. And I know we didn't succeed ultimately.
I do appreciate that, and I completely get it. Although I would say, there is a saying, never believe your own propaganda, especially and in politics.
We don't have Crossrail didn't have propaganda.
But no, I do understand. I think it's just about, it's sort of, I suppose, having those honest conversations, and without wanting to go back to the previous conversation, when you've got someone like the Mayor of London and the question of what they are seeing, I think it is important. But yes, I completely take on board what you say. Howard, do you have anything to add? Sorry, on the Pudding Mill Lane incident and its impact on the overall delivery of the project?
I think Simon said it, as you say. It delayed dynamic testing. There were many other issues around at the same time.
Sure. And Andrew, just coming back to you, can I ask why, because given this seems like a pretty serious incident, why an adverse event notice was not issued?
I think it's a good point. I think, we didn't issue many event notices, certainly in my tenure. Understanding the precise implication of what this happened and whether or not one should have put an adverse event notice. Perhaps we didn't put in quite enough of these. Perhaps we didn't put the flag up the pole quite enough. We thought that this was fairly sort of seismic when you put them in. But you are right. I think, you can analyse the detail of whether it made a difference to the opening date or not. It was a big event. It actually diverted management time. It was potentially a very serious event in terms of public safety. And that's why, as Simon says, there were thousands of hours being deflected onto an issue that shouldn't have happened, that should have gone into tuning the final detail and the interface within the tunnel. So I think if we put in an advent event notice, I'm not entirely sure it would have changed the course of the programme. Of course it would have changed the course, but it would have made people more aware. And I think that, that is a good point, Tom, and perhaps lessons learned in the future.
It's interesting, and because actually, from what we've heard, it was, I'm not sure if brushed under the carpet is quite the word, but when it came to TfL board, and Sir Terry reported it in January 2018, the board went to the private session. It was recorded in sort of quite bland, that's the word, yes, bland language in the minutes of the board meeting, I think. So, and I think that some people have sort of raised the question of, well, given this was quite a seismic event, might that have been the point to step back? And I know this wouldn't have just been your decision. You've got DFT, TfL and the Mayor. Step back, take stock and say, well, maybe we do need now to think about, I don't know if rephasing is the word, but rephasing the programme perhaps, and perhaps acknowledging that the December opening date was simply not realistic.
I'm saying I think it's a good observation, and I think we can't now turn the clock back and put one in.
Sure, of course.
Had we put one in, would that have just sort of, been the pause that I think Mark Weil was talking about?
And did you change the way that risks were flagged and how incidents were responded to following the Pudding Mill Lane incident?
No, I don't think we did. I think that Simon's described the risk management process, I think it was robust. You know, you hope that your risk management process picks up every risk that's out there. It doesn't. There are some risks that you don't pick up, and there's some risks like the pudding mill lane thing that is, you know, is the unknown unknown. We did not have on our risk register pudding mill lane transformer blowing up. But, you know, by and large, and I know we can be critical and take the lessons learned from that last phase, by and large, the risk management of the huge task of creating the infrastructure of Crossrail, by and large, that went well. We've spoken about it, and we focus on this last element, and there are lessons to take away from that.
But if I could just point out, Tom, the failure was a contractor design failure. Contractors under the NEC form of contract run their own self-certification quality management system. That is the way the contract is construed. We don't check everything. We don't have the manpower to check everything. And this very complicated wiring in these multiple cabinets are their own quality assurance. We check their assurance process is robust, and their assurance process was in good shape, but they failed to spot this design fault until too late. And so it is a feature, and it's, again, another lessons learned. In the old days, and I sound like an old git going back to, back in the good old days, we would have checked these things as clients with a significant team of technical specialists ourselves, as what we used to call inspectors and clerks of works and all that sort of thing. That's not really the style anymore. Under NEC, it's self-certification by contractors.
I think this is a wider issue that we've seen.
It is a wider industry issue, yes.
Grenfell, the building industry, everything, absolutely.
Not
yes, I acknowledge that. Can I come finally on to this issue about the dynamic testing, and maybe I could come to Howard on this one. Why did you make the decision to start dynamic testing in conditions where the signalling installation and infrastructure were incomplete? I think Mark Wilde has said that in hindsight they wouldn't have done that.
No, well, I mean, that's a judgment to be made as to what point. If you don't, there's clearly two schools of thought, and the reports that have actually been commissioned since, I vividly remember there's John Boss's report, which is one of the reports that's been done, that actually is very strong on the logic of starting testing as early as possible, because as early as possible you find the issues with this complex systems, the longer amount of time you've got to sort them later. So that's one school of thought. The other is self-evidently that it's much more efficient to wait until virtually everything is in place and then continue. At the time when we started dynamic testing, I think it was back in February, we were keeping open the possibility of December. We were holding to being able to complete dynamic testing in a way that would have supported December. Clearly in retrospect, we'd have done things differently. Waited a bit longer.
Yeah, I agree with that. There are two schools of thought. I mean, we were supported in moving forward with earlier dynamic testing by all of our panels. So our expert panel, Chris Green, who chairs our systems expert panel, was a very strong supporter of earlier dynamic testing. And I know Mark has said differently. You can have a number of different views on this, and it's a judgment call. We felt, on balance, that going earlier did give us results that would result with that we were able then to deal with issues that would be found with as much time as possible to solve them. The thing about software is you find a bug, you need time to fix it. So the earlier you find the bug, the longer you've got to fix it. The later you test, obviously if you don't test, you won't find the bugs. So the later you test, you've by definition got less time to fix them. On balance, we felt therefore it was worthwhile going earlier, even though we had immaturity in both train and in the systems, in the infrastructure as well. So on balance, we took that decision. I still support it because I think we didn't lose much or anything by doing it, because we only tested in windows, short windows, often 2 days, and those 2 days would not have been used for anything else in terms of work in the trace, in the tunnels, because you can't have people work 24/7, 7 days a week. European legislation, all that, people need a break, a rest. And those 2 days, the rest days for the construction crews, were when we did the testing. So I don't think much or anything was lost by that. And I'm a supporter of it.
Andrew, do you have anything to add on?
Look, my own view, my own principle, my own philosophy is start the testing as early as you possibly could. And if you go back into the programme, we had, Bombardier and Derby had what they call Train Zero to test the software. Siemens had 2 labs. The early testing at the Melton test track. All of these are taking forward the risk curve to make sure that when you arrive finally for your dynamic testing, you have as little risk as possible. One of the biggest regrets was, I think, the interface test laboratory that Crossrail set up. And in the same way that the stage 2 trains were suffering from lack of issuing of the software versions, so too was that test lab. So that was an opportunity missed. It's a lesson learned, but it only follows the principle of bringing that dynamic testing, whether it's live testing in the tunnels or testing in the laboratory, bring the whole thing forward as early as you possibly can.
Thank you very much.
Okay, let's move on to look at the issue of rolling stock. And I'm going to mostly aim my questions at Howard. Can I just be clear, Howard? So off the TfL website, it was very clear the contract for the provision of the rolling stock and depot for the Crossrail project has been awarded by Transport for London to Bombardier. So it was a TfL contract. Is that correct?
Yeah, so for rolling stock, the simple division, it's a TfL contract for the reason that TfL bought the trains for cash. There was a PFI discussion at the beginning of it, you'll recall. And because the contract for the trains includes maintenance and continues for more than 30 years. So for that reason, you would never place the contract for the trains through the projects company, through Crossrail. Crossrail has the responsibility for running the procurement exercise for those trains, and a Crossrail project responsibility is to integrate all the elements of the project, so trains and systems and the like. So
the contract was awarded by TfL, but
the
you're saying the procurement was carried out by Crossrail?
Yes, the procurement exercise under the PDA is a Crossrail responsibility, so I was involved in it, but it went to the Crossrail board to recommend. Yes, because TfL was the counterparty to the contract.
Perfect.
But as I say, that's because the contract goes on way beyond the point where the Crossrail project ends.
Okay, so that's clear now, thank you. So there were concerns about the rolling stock. So Terry Morgan says it was one of the big causes of the delay. Crossrail issued an adverse event notice in July 27 due to the delays with the delivery of the rolling stock. Siemens wrote to Mike Brown saying that the trains were 18 months behind schedule in February 2018. Can you give me an outline of what was really going on with the rolling stock, how delayed it was and the impact that's had on the project, please?
Right, so the train, as we've said, is a very complex train and works in different ways on different bits of track. So base one is really to say that the train is out there and has been since June 17, running between Shenfield and Liverpool Street. So on Meliha's railway at the moment, 345's out every day, they work very well. You can always improve railways, but actually that's now one of the highest performing sections of railway that we've got in the country. So good. Other parts of the software are used in conjunction with the CBTC, the signalling system, the metro-style signalling system in the central section. And there, the trains currently are being used for dynamic testing. So at the moment, the trains are running up and down. I've been on one. I actually took the picture that's, I think, on the TfL website, which is a train running at 60 miles an hour, up and down through the central tunnels. We also have trains running out between Paddington and Hayes and Harlington. And we're continuing to test the version of the train that goes to Heathrow, because that has the third signalling system on it, ETCS, and that's what's being tested pretty well every Friday at the moment.
My question is not what's out there now, it's how much of a delay to the project was this delay in the rolling stock actually becoming available?
In practice, I would say very little, because as we've talked about, at the point where we could start dynamic testing, there were a number of issues. So was the train perfect at that stage? Absolutely not. Was the signalling system installed fully in the central section? No. With the radio systems and the platform doors in at that section? No. Ditto with perhaps the most tricky bit, which is the transition testing, where the train moves between the different systems at the portals. Again, the physical infrastructure for that wasn't finally in place until quite recently.
Right. So basically you're saying it's not had, because nothing else was ready, the delays of the trains, and they were delayed, hasn't had an impact.
It's had some impact in how how the project is undertaken, particular bits. Is it the dominant reason for delay on Crossrail? No.
No. Okay. Now, in terms of Bombardier, they are delivering these trains. They're also supposed to be delivering the Gospel Oak to Barking Line trains, and they failed on that, and they were late in this. You know, what issues are you taking out with them in terms of managing the contract with them to ensure that any issues are ironed out with this rolling stock?
So, Bombardier, we manage the contract very closely. The contract is very different, actually, to the contracts used for construction. So it's a fixed price contract. So actually, in the present situation, not only have we've paid no more for the trains, for the delay, if you like, we've actually had money back by way of damages, as you would expect under a rolling stock contract. We manage it very closely, have daily, weekly meetings and phone calls. The Bombardier senior hierarchy were actually in London yesterday. I personally was out at the Bombardier signalling section at Stockholm on Monday. So we're managing the contract very closely in contractual terms and also in technical terms. The new bit that again I think is significant is we're now at the stage where the train needs to work very, very closely indeed with the other systems, because the train, parts of the signalling system for the central section are actually on board the train, and the train also makes use of the radio systems in the tunnel, has to work with the platform screen doors. So that's where we've got a new team in recent months, system integration specialists, who are looking forward, if you like, in terms of where the issues, not just with the train, but in how it works with all the other complex systems on Crossrail, where those issues might be, and address them in advance.
Okay, I'm going to move to a colleague to deal with all the signalling issues. Do you think there's an issue here for Bombardier's reputation in terms of delays to this rolling stock? We're benefiting financially because they haven't delivered their contract on time. The Gospel Oak to Barking Line. Do you think there are issues with Bombardier as a company?
Sorry, so just to be clear, Bombardier are not benefiting financially.
No, I know, I said that.
Absolutely.
I said we have.
Sorry.
I said that we, as in TfL, public purse.
Misheard you. Absolutely, there is a reputational issue for Bombardier, and they're acutely aware of it.
Are they?
Is what I would say. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Right. Let's move on to Network Rail signalling systems and stations.
Great,
Assembly
thank
Member
you.
Curtin.
Yeah. Good afternoon. So my questions are to you in Network Rail, and particularly to do with the signalling systems and the stations that you are meant to be delivering, I believe, as part of your responsibility. Now, in our September committee meeting, we had Sir Terry Morgan before us, and he said basically you have a fixed price contract for a scope of work. But this had not been delivered as much as in the expectations of Crossrail. So what are your comments on that? And what have you not delivered, and what could have been done better?
So shall I start off with some general comments, and Meliha will jump in with the Anglia northeastern related part. So I guess the first point to make is that of all of the things that we were required to deliver as part of our contract, Andrew said it wasn't a contract. There's an agreement which looks and feels like a contract, even though it was in technical terminology was called a protocol. And we had to deliver a number of changes to the surface railway lines in order to support the running of the Crossrail trains. And these involved changes to the infrastructure, so extending platforms to accommodate the trains, signalling equipment, as well as passenger experience things, step-free access and improvements to the station concourses and the ticket halls. Our work is currently 90% complete. So from all of the items of scope that we were required to deliver, we've delivered 90% of them, and they have been delivered on time. And had we been required to run the Crossrail train service in stage 4 in May of this year, we would have been ready to run those trains. We have had some issues at some of the stations, and particularly around the timings of the delivery of the work that's needed to deliver the passenger experience. So we split the work into 2 parts. Firstly, the signalling and the platform extensions and everything that will be needed to effectively to enable a Crossrail train to safely stop at the station, and delivered that work on time. Some of the work for step-free access, for improvements to the experience that passengers will receive as they pass through the station, has taken longer than we'd hoped originally, but that work will be complete by the end of December next year, December 2020. And that timing, that delay, has been agreed progressively with Crossrail through the processes that we've spoken about.
And I think the point Rupert made, the infrastructure on Anglia is ready to welcome the Crossrail trains. In terms of the upgrades to our tracks, signalling, stations, the railway, you mentioned it earlier, we already run Crossrail services between Shamfield and Liverpool Street with 97.8% reliability. So there is nothing stopping from the infrastructure perspective from making Elizabeth Line happen. But as Rupert mentioned, there are still some ongoing works at stations across my patch, in various stations and various stages. Most of them are complete. The 2 that is still outstanding are Ilford and Romford, where we have still some significant works to complete.
Okay, thank you. So you mentioned stage 4 and the Anglia section,
Yep.
But then there's also stage 5 and the western section. And one of the problems, as I understand, is the implementation of the new signalling system. And originally, as I understand, you were going to put ECTS, this brand new signalling section, all the way from Paddington to Heathrow. But somewhere along the line, someone made a decision not to do that, and only to put ECTS in the Heathrow tunnel. And that's now led to problems in the system's integration. So who made that decision, and what's going to be done about it?
So let me pick that up, and Meli can jump in. So the decisions around the type of signalling systems that will be used on Crossrail were taken relatively early on, and were complex in their nature, and that's because these systems, at the time when the decisions were taken, were relatively new in their stage of development and deployment. And in fact, at the time when Crossrail was getting going, there was no ETCS system that could deliver the level of performance and the level of frequency of trains in the tunnel section, which is why the decision was taken to use the CBTC system in the central tunnel section that was taken. Network Rail has been progressively utilising the ETCS technology in order to deliver a better train service for passengers and use the railway capacity that we have as effectively as we can do. And you're absolutely right. We had previously committed to provide this technology right into Paddington from Heathrow. When it became clear that the technology itself wasn't maturing in the way in which we needed it to, and B, the infrastructure itself, the changes to the infrastructure were complex and were taking time, we agreed with Crossrail that we would continue to utilise the existing signalling technology on that stretch of railway between Paddington and the junction with the main line that leads into Heathrow, and that the ETCS technology will be built into and deployed on that section of track between Airport Junction and Heathrow Airport to enable the Crossrail trains to utilise ETCS on that part of the railway, and that the ETCS technology would be applied to the rest of the railway from Paddington to Airport Junction and beyond as soon as we could practically do it. Now, that doesn't mean that there's any lower level of safety. The existing system is operating today and provides as resilient as a system as we possibly can. And in fact, the Crossrail trains would have to use a similar system on the leg from Liverpool Street to Shenfield in any case, colour light signalling with train protection. So we agreed with Crossrail Limited that we would postpone the deployment of ETCS into Paddington, recognising that although it added an extra interface, the same interface as on the other side, it was something that could be accommodated by the operational aspect of the trains.
So it seems you're saying that the old legacy system, you have that on the branch up to Shenfield, and you've sort of found a way of integrating the CBTC on the central section with the old legacy system. That's no problem, and there's no problem at Paddington. But there is a problem at where the tunnel goes in. Is that right? So there's still issues with getting the trains to work on the Heathrow spur. Is that still the situation now?
So I'll perhaps let Howard pick that up in a second. It is worth just saying that yes, the different signalling systems require the train to speak to them in different ways, but they are set out in clear standards which are well known about and have been well rehearsed.
It's very good. Yeah, I just sort of, I mean, what I'm trying to work out is when were these problems known about, and when are they all going to be solved?
Sorry,
the problems, the ETCS. Is this now a problem because you don't have ETCS going all the way to Paddington, and that was supposed to be something that was delivered? So is that still a problem for the trainers operating or not? And when is it actually now? Do you have a plan to put ETCS all the way to Paddington? Do you have a date for that and a plan for that?
So yes, we have a plan for it. I'll let Howard speak in a moment about whether or not it's a problem, because Howard needs to speak for the train and the drivers that use it. But I must stress that the signalling system that's operational there at the moment, the Crossrail trains can use that signalling system. It's colour light signals with the proper safety protections that exist at the moment. It isn't causing any issue or problem or delay to deployment of the Crossrail service.
Okay. Right. So yeah, the absence of ETCS from the portal to Stockley Junction, so-called, is an irritant, if you like, rather than a major problem. It just means that when we run a train, we'll have to transition once at the portal at Westbourne Park and then do another transition a few miles down when we'd only otherwise do one. So irritant, but not major problem. Okay. The bit that's not finished yet is testing the trains with the ETCS system that is fitted between the airport junction and into Heathrow itself. And that's at the stage where trains are testing every week. They now need to make sure that it's sufficiently reliable. So again, you'll catch this in the wider Crossrail context. It's not so much at this stage about making the train and the system work once, or even, dare I say, 99 times out of 100. You need to prove to yourself that it works 999 times out of 1,000. So we're at that stage where trains are running quite successfully every Friday night when other trains aren't running, but we're not at the stage where we think it's sufficiently reliable and stable enough to extend the new trains to the tunnel. So at the present time, we're using the existing trains. TfL Rail Services use the existing trains that are already fitted with another signalling system, I'm afraid to say, that's already in the tunnel.
Okay. Do you want us to come in?
Yes. Can I just refer this back to the point you made around the adverse event notice? Because the adverse event notice, and Tom's gone, used in circumstances where there is a risk on the opening or a staged opening. In this case, it was clear to us, and I think Howard and Mike Brown Bombardier did a good job in diverting attention from the Stage 2 train that required it to go into the Heathrow tunnels on ETCS to the Stage 3 train. But the event notice was put in place because in May 2017, trains from Paddington should be running into Heathrow. That service is provided, but not by a C345 train. A C345 in a shuttle service up to Hayes and Harlington, and the existing Heathrow Connect train. I do happen to know about this because I built Heathrow Express, and I also built Terminal 5 at the end of it. And I understand the capacity that exists within those tunnels. But the wider point, I think, and again, this is about lessons learned for Crossroad too, is that if you look at what was happening at the time when we were signing the contract with Network Rail, between Paddington and Reading were 4 big programmes going on. Introduction of electrification, introduction of new IEP trains, introduction of ETCS, introduction of Crossrail. And I think when sponsors look at these big programmes and work out the conflicts and the congestion of putting all these things in one pot, you have to be very, very careful. So warning to Crossrail to understand, the components of the national network and how they will influence. And it was true, and it may be the case that we've thrown technology at it, but ETCS was meant to come into Paddington. Actually, in the early days, ETCS was meant to go from Reading right the way through the central area. That would have been a very simple programme to do. And as you, Rupert, rightly say, there wasn't the ETCS level 3 technology to allow operations of metro services in tunnels, and so the Crossroad board and the sponsors together said, we'll do that to CBTC. Extra technology, more interfaces. Second thing, ETCS not coming to Paddington. Extra technology, more interfaces. So these things happen in the course of these programs, and you can't put fault on it. It is just something that the sponsors should be aware of. And as we are in the heat of the battle in delivering these things, and these unknown unknowns come across, these sponsor things come, they are significant. And I think that I'd just like to offer that to the chair to say that there are things that sponsors can do, and there are things that sponsors should be aware of. It was a hugely complicated programme in the west of London, and we were aware of it, and arguably in CP5, which is the control point that actually Network Rail dealt with that, there was too much going on at the time. Possibly why ETCS wasn't involved.
Thanks for all your answers so far. I just want to pick up on something you said and put it together with something you said before. So the original plan was to have ETCS all the way through the whole of Crossrail, but then someone is that right? But you've got CBTC.
It was a very early plan.
Early planning, okay. But now you mentioned ETCS level 3. Is that something that didn't exist before, that exists now, that you could put in the central tunnel now if you wanted to?
Shall I answer this? Sorry,
okay, yeah.
So, having been involved in the decision way back, so as you say, ETCS basically doesn't work in a metro environment with 30 trains, up to 30 trains now are platform screen doors. So there, it was the decision very early on. People were hoping you could find one system that did the whole lot. In 2010 or so, it was realised that there was no prospect of having a system like that covered the whole thing. So that was when the decision was made to segment it up. Even today, if you had to make that same decision today, you still wouldn't have a proven system that would operate the central section that's also applicable. We hope we're closer to it, or the railway industry, I'm speaking on behalf of now, says we hope we're closer to it, but ETCS level 3, so-called, still doesn't exist in any workable form.
So another question just comes to my mind. This CBTC seems to be, a sort of a more advanced system with a moving block signalling.
Yes.
Would it have been better to put that in the Heathrow tunnel for the future, rather than ETCS?
Answer that one very briefly. No, essentially that's the proprietary system that works on things like the Victoria line and the Jubilee line. They come from different manufacturers, but they're optimised for metro systems. They're so-called moving block. The biggest, most fundamental thing is they don't work with more than one type of train.
Okay.
So effectively, this is that you need to then put a bit of signalling kit on each train that's ever going to use it, and quite a complicated bit on every train. So where you've got national rail tracks, they work to a completely different technology and philosophy. So it wasn't really an option, unfortunately.
Okay, thanks. That explains it. Okay, right. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Assembly Member Russ wants to pick up on stations, and then you'll move into the last section, delivering Crossroad.
Exactly. Yes, I want to pick up on the problem with the completion of the outer stations. So I understand that these are the responsibility of Network Rail, and that the delays seem to have been partly due to budgetary constraints, which was what Mark Wilde reported to us in November 2018. So just to start off with, Rupert and Meliha, if you were able to just say, how were the delays and problems with the outer stations communicated to Crossrail?
So shall I kick off and then you can pick up? I think first of all, I'd like to make the point that we are fully funded to complete the works which need to be completed by Network Rail to open the Crossrail service. So we have no funding issues or budgetary issues at the moment. And we've delivered 90%.
Okay, we're going to be going into a bit more detail in the funding in the next bit of questioning. So right now I'm wanting to focus just on how you were communicating the delay to Crossrail.
As I said earlier on in the session, having a contractor-client relationship with Crossrail, each period we provided a report to our Crossrail colleagues which would have identified the issues early on, and as I think Simon suggested, the teams work closely together and talk with each other and agree the approaches that we can take in order to mitigate the impact of any delay for whatever reason that is identified. And in the case of the stations, we agreed that we would deliver the work that was needed to run the trains, so the operational aspects, the platform lengthening and the signalling associated with that, so that the trains could run, and then follow on and deliver the new ticket halls, the step-free access that's required to run to provide the very best experience for passengers.
The thing is that the step-free access, the new ticket halls, those are all things that make a big difference to Londoners.
Yep.
And what it seems is that those elements are being delayed because of all the other complicated issues. And actually, those things could have been in place by now. More Londoners would have more step-free interchanges. And, we had an email to the committee from someone from Ealing Broadway, and we actually visited Ealing Broadway as a committee and saw the very desperate need for the upgrades both around the station in terms of how people access the station, the sort of hostile street environment, and also the conditions at the station itself where we've been told, there's no lift, there's a single door as an entrance, there's no fire escape. The platform at one point has just 1 metre between a wall and the yellow line with passengers trying to get past. These are not great conditions for the travelling public. And it seems worrying that these upgrades to the station have got shunted back, and you say that you've been in dialogue with Crossrail, that you agreed with them that step-free access was going to be delayed, pushed back until December 2020. What was was there any interrogation of that decision to actually delay the step-free access? Because makes a big difference to some of the Londoners who find it hardest to get around. And I just want to check whether their interests were bought into that thinking, or whether it was entirely the big picture.
Let me address your point, because it is a really good one and a really important one, and it's actually broader than just Crossrail. So that the first point to make is that Network Rail and our train operator colleagues always make sure that we're operating a safe system and a safe railway, and that stations are safe as they can be. Some stations are overcrowded. We all experience it. Londoners experience it every day. We all do. And in Network Rail, we have a clear process of identifying which stations are most overcrowded and where we need to try and improve access at those stations. And I've had separate discussions with some of the other members about the priority stations that we're trying to address, and we really appreciate the help that we're getting to prioritise and accelerate funding for the works of these stations. Ealing Broadway is a good example of a station that is crowded now, even overcrowded at times now, and needs to be addressed. And you're right, the Crossrail improvements will provide relief for the Londoners who use Ealing Broadway. Those improvements, though, are being delivered to support the Crossrail programme, and therefore they're needed for when the Crossrail trains start running. And the work that we have done closely with our colleagues in Crossrail to identify and prioritise what's needed and when, what type of work is required and when, resulted in the decision that we would allow the step-free access to be and other changes at the stations themselves, in the concourses and ticket halls to be delivered later and progressively through this year and through next year. So
Are they
this was thought about very
by
carefully.
the same work teams? Is it that you've got a limited number of people working on the project, so you've prioritised the platform extensions, or are they different people who would be working on the step-free and the other station improvements?
So in order to deliver the eventual benefits as quickly as possible, we separated the work out into separate contracts for delivery of the works to the platforms and the signalling, for delivery of the enabling works, so the foundations for the step-free access and the complex civil engineering, and then the slightly more cosmetic changes. We divided these contracts up, and we have enough resource to deliver them to the schedule that we've agreed with Crossrail. There isn't a sort of resource constraint in that sense, and it is different teams doing the work.
So if it is different teams doing the work and there isn't a resource constraint, is there anything to stop, and particularly looking forward to Crossrail 2, that a lesson out of this project should be that those benefits that could benefit Londoners, like the step-free access, the things that are not, they're not part of a critical path in terms of, getting your signalling right, those benefits could have been delivered sooner. And I'm just wondering, if I'd be interested also if Crossrail people have got anything to say on this, just in terms of lessons for future projects. Can we not make sure that those benefits like the step-free access that could be benefiting people right now couldn't be prioritised, particularly if that's not going to hold up any of the mission critical stuff in terms of signalling?
You're right, and I'll let the Crossrail team expand on it in a minute. I think it is worth noting that, for example, we delivered Abbey Wood Station in 2017, and Londoners have been benefiting from that. And clearly, if programme constraints allow benefits to be delivered early, it will be a good thing to do that, and that should be a lesson that's taken forward to Crossrail 2. Please don't forget, though, that the works that Network Rail has had to be delivering are on some of the most highly used parts of the railway in the country. Millions of Londoners every day travelling in and out of these terminus stations, and therefore the ability just to sort of get on with things isn't quite as simple as just saying, well, let's go in tomorrow and do the work. It needs to be planned in advance and managed around the operation of the existing train service to enable London to keep moving while we deliver.
Of course, I completely understand that point, but I think it is, when you were talking at the beginning, you sort of said you'd agreed with Crossrail to delay the step-free access, and it just, I just think it's really important that when these big engineering projects are happening, that the most vulnerable Londoners, the ones who need the most help to travel, that their needs are not pushed to the bottom of the priority list.
It's a really good point.
Particularly when it doesn't.
It's a very good point.
Okay.
Thank you.
Just to add, if I may, the original plan was to do it a lot earlier. I think there was no sort of deliberate intent to have it delayed. There are various circumstances that have led to these delays, which we have had to absorb.
Sorry, when you say various circumstances?
Well, for instance, originally on the Western stations, designs were put forward which would not have met the planning requirements, and therefore there was a need to go back and redesign a lot of stations. So there were this is going back years and years now, even before my time. So there's various difficulties and challenges around getting these stations, very complicated. Rupert spells it out very clearly. There are massive difficulties around dealing with what seemingly are simple issues but actually aren't straightforward. And it's taken quite a long time to get back into a place where we then got planning permission. We then have to, Network Rail then have to go out to tender. Then there were issues around the value for money of the tenders that came back and having to go back and renegotiate and so on and so on. So there's been some issues. And of course, we would all have loved to have done it earlier. And so I absolutely agree with you that there was no question of sort of deliberately delaying this. It was a question of doing it as fast as was possible, but there were challenges along the way.
Andrew just wanted indicated.
I think it's a really good point that you made, and I think a lesson for Crossroad 2 and any other major programme is that the PDA originally, the scope originally, did not include full accessibility along the whole line. And if you remember, probably discussions in this room around why was that the case. I think it was a fantastic win to be able to get every station to be fully accessible. And I know that it was a combination between Network Rail putting in some money, DFT putting in some money, Crossrail doing the vast majority of the job, Access for All putting in some money, but I absolutely understand the importance and the sensitivity of this issue and the community of Londoners who require a modern railway, a new railway, to have from day one full accessibility. So it is an absolute requirement that the PDA of a Crossrail 2, and this will be difficult politically because these will go through stations, some of which have very low ridership, some of which are Victorian in their very nature. Putting in full access is something that has to be done on today's modern railways, but it requires resources, and those resources must be allocated to that purpose.
Just to add, so absolutely agree. We've been closely involved. It was TfL and DFT that funded jointly the last 7 stations that weren't due to be made step-free. Good news is that actually in the east, in the last 2 weeks, you may know Maryland, Manor Park, actually Seven Kings and Forest Gate stations have all, the lifts have gone into service in the last couple of weeks. So not job done by any means, but point absolutely taken.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Well, should we move on to the next stage? East side clearly seems to be delivering really well. The west side, so let's just be clear, West Ealing, Ealing Broadway and Acton, we're told, are being repriced with bidders. When will we have a clear plan for those stations? Because the communities around those stations really want to know when are our works going to be done?
So as I've said, those stations, we expect and are planning to complete those stations by December of next year, as agreed with Crossrail. If it's possible to complete them sooner, we will do that. And Simon has quite rightly said that there wasn't any decision to actively delay anything. We're dealing with the circumstances as they come up. So we have a plan and a programme to complete the stations. As I said shortly before, we divided the work into several different contracts to get the delivery done as quickly as it possibly can be. And we can engage individually with those boroughs if there are particular issues associated with any of the stations.
Yeah, okay, great, thanks. Sorry, Caroline.
Okay, yes, so then final section of our questions, actually looking at overall delivering Crossrail. We know that the revised date for the opening of the central section was stated in August to be autumn 2019, but Crossrail has not committed to an opening date. Mike Brown told the committee on the 21st of December he hoped Crossrail would be able to provide clear information on the possible opening date by the end of March 2019. But reports at the end of February suggested Crossrail would be able to provide a timeline for opening by April 2019. And the monthly update to the committee from Crossrail in February highlighted various elements that are behind schedule. The static testing, too early to determine whether testing for the main dynamic testing will be complete. The Tier 1 suppliers' substantial demobilisation so is being achieved according to plan. So that's workforce being let go to presumably to help to keep costs down. So do you have concerns, given all of this context, with your ability to deliver on the works, and how are these concerns being addressed and particularly communicated to stakeholders? So does Howard, do you want to?
I was going to say, by process of elimination, I think I get that one. I mean, forgive me if it hasn't found its way round yet, but I think Mark Wilde wrote to Caroline yesterday with the latest update. And I mean, that explains that what's happening at the moment, you'll not be surprised to hear that, you know, nobody at Crossrail is up for announcing dates, windows or anything like that we don't believe in. Huge amount of work going on at the moment into the forward-looking programme. That's taken a bit longer than I think was originally anticipated. What Mark said in his letter yesterday was that I believe in April the work will come to a conclusion and we'll be able to talk about opening for the central section. In what terms, I don't think we yet know. And then from that, obviously follows the other sections because you need the central section open in order to connect the surface sections in, although the surface sections themselves will probably be running slightly more trains on those in the meantime.
And what about the communication with stakeholders? So is there a plan for, Londoners are interested in what's going on, and we've heard obviously and absolutely taken on board the impossibility of fixed timings because things depend on each other happening. But is there a strategy for letting people know what's happening, even given the constraints of constructing a very complicated project?
So yes, one of the strands of work that's going on at the moment, due to conclude, in the next few weeks, as we've said, does include how we'll both communicate that and update what it means for each of the sections of the railway. At the moment, the key point is that until we're clear on the programme going forward, we'd risk confusing people yet again. So therefore, clarity on the central section next few weeks, and then from that a communication strategy talking about how we'll keep people up to date afterwards.
Okay. Does anyone else want to come in on that? So Rupert and Meliha, yes, Mike and Rupert, you started to touch on this. This is about the funding. Mike Brown clarified to this committee on the 21st of December that any funding required by Network Rail to complete your sections of the scheme is outside of the new funding package for Crossrail. And in his update to the committee, Crossrail indicated that Network Rail's funding proposal has been agreed by the Secretary of State on the 29th of January. So can you tell us what has been agreed with the Department for Transport with regards to funding, and whether you are comfortable that you've got the funding that you need?
So the first thing I'll say is yes, we're comfortable that we have the funding that we need. Then in a little bit more detail, as we've heard, there was an agreement with Crossrail Limited to deliver a scope of works for £2.3 billion. And due to cost pressures that we've spoken a little bit about, we recognise that further funding will be needed, and that has been provided, and we're really pleased that it has, through an agreement with the Department for Transport, for a further £290 million to complete the rest of the works. Any money that's required beyond that to get the works completed on time, as we've already said, will come from within Network Rail's internal budgets, and we will manage them within our usual process of managing contingency.
Okay, thank you. And then further to that, and we've heard a bit about things like planning permissions at outer stations already. Do you think that that this funding package that you've got provides you with sufficient to complete all the outer stations, and also have you got all the planning permissions you need to do your outer stations? Do you have a timeline for that final work?
If I mention where we are with the Anglia ones, the two outstanding stations are Ilford and Romford. And actually tomorrow I have a meeting with the Redbridge Council at Ilford Station, because we're going to talk them through our plans. So in terms of, do I have the money I need to deliver the two remaining stations? Absolutely, that is included in the latest funding package. Early contractor engagement has started already. We are working with Walkers and their designer Atkins. We already have the sign designed by the council. So the planning permission has been given. So we are basically in the delivery phase, which has started already in December last year.
Okay, and what about the rest?
On the Western Station, so as I've said, the contract for the enabling works, the foundations for the step-free access and some other things was let, and that work has largely been completed. We were able to do much of that work over the Christmas closure of the railway, which, although clearly affected passengers very severely, enabled us to get on and do the work. And then the contract for the remaining 6 ticket halls between Acton Main Line and West Drayton has been split into 2 different packages. a contractor for the construction at West Drayton, Hayes and Harlington and Southall has been selected, and we've announced who that is. And then we're in the process of reviewing the contracts for the work for Acton Main Line, West Ealing and Ealing Broadway, and we'll be awarding that contract very, very shortly. That is on time in the context of what we said we will achieve by the end of next year, and as you would expect.
Okay, so you're comfortable...
We're funded for that work, and we have agreed with the boroughs the necessary planning permission to get on and do it.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. That comes to the end of our meeting. I'm sorry we have overrun, but we had a lot of issues to get through. Thank you very much indeed, Andrew, Simon, Howard, Rupert and Meliha for coming. If there's anything that you wanted to mention that you didn't come up with today, please do write to us. And Rupert, we really would like, as soon as possible, those Network Rail monthly reports. I think they'll be really helpful in our work. Members, can we note the report and the discussion and delegate authority to me in consultation with group lead members to agree the final output for our work on Crossroad?
Agreed.
Lovely. And item 7, can I ask us committee to agree to hold a meeting on the 25th of April for a Q&A session with the Commissioner of TfL?
Agreed.
And agree our work programme for the remainder of the year. And the date of our next meeting will be 25th of April at 10 o'clock in the Chamber with Mike Brown. Thank you all very much, members and our guests.
GLA Chamber Sound.